English translation 709th Contact. Part 1 Sunday, the 29th of July 2018, 1:41 hours.
Greetings and welcome to you both, Yupta and also you Quetzal. Nice to see you, and besides, I have some questions and things to discuss, which is why I think our meeting today should be an official conversation, which I will then retrieve and also write down.
Thanks for your welcome and greeting, Edward. I also greet you, my friend, and I think it will be too early for you to work on the computer again. But if you allow and want, I would like to hear from you what happened to your detriment. Because during my last 3 short visits, the few remarks were not enough to be able to exchange the necessary information, because we mainly had to discuss the various work that had to be done in the field. There was also no discussion between Ptah and I about what had happened to you, which is why I would now like to be informed in detail by you, if you will allow me. I also have the need to know a little more because you were, as usual, sparing with further details, as is always the case when it comes to your personality and your concerns. But I would like to know whether you want to work on the computer again, because I think that will still be questionable after your serious accident, and also when, through your own steady efforts, you are able to use your arm and hand again in a way that is extremely astonishing to me, because the injury you suffered was and is undeniably of a more serious nature than you consider it to be.
I know that, and to that I can say up front that from what the assistant surgeon had explained to me, I could not have made any other decision but to turn down an operation, because with only a 30% chance of surviving the operation, the decision was unquestionably clear to me.
You already told me that the other day during one of my visits, which is why I think your decision was also correct not to consent to surgery because you reasonably assessed the risks explained to you correctly and could not advocate surgical intervention.
Exactly. But if I have to, I want to take up and tell the whole thing in a little more detail from the beginning, although that will take some time. But now I would like to take up some other things first, which seem more important to me.
We are not in a hurry, and we can also talk about it later.
So then I want to raise some of my concerns first.
You can, of course, but before you talk about anything else, I urge you to be aware that there are new machinations afoot to create a new worldwide controversy about you and your work. This is being done underhandedly in a manner of alleged scientific investigation and research to misleadingly give the whole thing a serious appearance in an attempt once again to smear your photographic and film material produced on our behalf regarding our flying apparatus, etc., as a fraudulent scheme. Efforts were also made to defame our joint contacts as lies and deception. However, as I suggested to you some time ago, you are not to get involved in any way whatsoever with regard to the photo and film material, and with regard to questions arising in connection with our contacts. If these are aimed at calling your honesty and our contacts into question, for the sake of your security, you should also make increased efforts again, because there are also signs in this respect that there is a renewed imponderability, which is why we will also make efforts to carry out increased surveillance, both with regard to your personality and to group members, in order to prevent perfidious offensives, if possible.
What you advised me to do, I have kept to and will also continue to do. And as far as the photos and the films are concerned, you can talk about them, speculate about them, deny them and slander them, as all the opponents and antagonists want, because I know what the truth is. Namely that I have not photographed any models, nor produced any other fakes, but have photographed your real beam ships and so on. Furthermore, and you also know this, original slides and negatives of photographs and films have long since ceased to exist, because on the one hand and have stolen and sold many originals, and I have only been able to buy back poor copies of them, and that for 10 marks each. This, while on the other hand, Schmid, who died in the late 1980s, also cheated me, as did, and who both earned a lot of money by selling the originals. Schmid, who was trained as a photographer, also faked hundreds of slides and negatives, as well as films in various ways, and made new, original slides from them, which he then returned to me as real originals. In the end, you also checked all the slides and negatives yourself, and found that I had only received forgeries back, so that today I do not even have a single original.
That is indeed the case, because also the slides marked as originals by Schmid correspond to forgeries that he had forged under threats. He did it, as you know, not maliciously, but because he was massively forced to do so by the U.S. intelligence agents of the they were also the ones who then comprehensively commandeered all the original slides.
But I would be interested to know what happened to these originals. You yourselves also only made copies of my first original photos, so you still have the unaltered photos.
The original slides, which were requisitioned from Schmid by the Secret Service agents, had already disappeared from the archives of the after 11 months and could no longer be found. They had, as you like to say, disappeared without a trace, gone untraceable, and have since been lost, as if blown away by the wind, whereby also our inquiries did not lead to their being found again.
Which is also what happened to various film and photographic material of the supposedly first but imaginary moon landing of the USA moon mission.
That is correct, but we do not want to talk about that now, but about what your concerns are that you want to bring up first.
Of course. But first I would like to ask a question about the following newspaper article, because in Germany the Reich citizens movement problem is once again on the rise. After an incident in the middle Franconian town of Georgensgmund in Germany on the 19th of October 2016, you spoke of well over 14,000 Reich citizens, exact number was 14,791, who existed in Germany. Now the number of Reich citizens has drastically increased, as announced by the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution.
Office for the Protection of the Constitution, Reichsbürger Movement, has around 18,000 followers. Epoch Times, the 29th of April, 2018, 11:22.
The Constitutional Protection Authorities classify 18,000 human beings as followers of the so-called Reichsbürger movement. The Reich citizens are seen fragmented into small groups that do not recognize the Federal Republic, its institutions and laws. For many of them, the German Reich continues to exist within the borders of 1937. About 950 of them are considered by the authorities to be right-wing extremists. As a spokesperson for the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, BFV, told the Tagesspiegel Sunday edition. In the BFV annual report for 2016, there was still talk of 10,000 Reich citizens, with 500 to 600 right-wing extremists. However, the increase in numbers does not mean that the scene has also grown to the same extent. The BFV spokesperson said that the increase was mainly due to the fact that the Constitutional Protection Authorities had succeeded in further elucidating the spectrum. In 2016, the Federal Office intensified its observation of the scene together with the state authorities. The reason for this were serious acts of violence. The militancy and armament of many Reich citizens is a cause of concern for the authorities. The BFE spokesman said that about 1,200 Reich citizens still had legal weapons permits. Since the beginning of 2017, with the help of the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, it has been possible to revoke the permits of 450 Reich citizens. AFP source www.epochtimes.dto000 anhanger A241269.3_._HTML.
Constitutional Protection Report. Reich citizens hostile to the state and extremist and ready for most serious acts of violence. Epoch Times, the 24th of July, 2018, 7:43.
The number of Reichsbürger and self-governors has risen sharply in the past year. They are classified as anti-state and extremist. Reichsbürger sometimes return their German identity cards and passports. The number of Reichsbürger and self-governors has risen sharply in the past year. This is reported by Bill Tuesday edition, with reference to the Verfassungsschutzbericht 2017 Reihe, which will be presented today in Berlin by Federal Interior Minister Horst Seehofer, CSU, and the President of the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, BFV, Hans-Georg Maaßen. At the end of 2017, the Office for the Protection of the Constitution counted around 16,500 persons in this scene, 2016. 10,000 persons, 900 2016, 500 to 600, of whom were right-wing extremists, it says. 3/4 of the scene, 74%, is male and older than 40, according to the BFV. According to the BFV report, both groups, the Reichsbürger and Selbstverwalter, deny the existence of the Federal Republic of Germany and also reject the legal system. The members are therefore currently classified by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution as anti-state and extremists. According to the Office for the Protection of the Constitution, the scene is highly militant and, in addition to its verbal aggressiveness, also has a high affinity for weapons. According to an assessment by the security agency, both the Reichsbürger and the Selbstverwalter are prepared to use their weapons for the most serious acts of violence.
Since our last count, the number of 14,791 Reich citizens has increased to 27,622 within a short time due to various sensationalistic presentations of media, such as television, newspapers, and journals, regarding the events in Georgensgmund on the 19th of October 2016. The rapid increase in the number of new Reich citizens who emerged in Germany was thus animated on the one hand by the sensationalistic media reports, but on the other hand, also to a large extent by the false, untenable political and state leadership that was hostile to freedom and the will of the people. In addition to the number of Reich citizens, which has grown to 27,622, many of whom are afraid of repression by the state and are therefore only secretly inclined towards their Reich citizenship, a number of more than 83,000 women and men in Germany, who feel a close attachment to a Reich citizen following and favor their ideology, sympathize according to our investigations. What also emerges, however, is the fact that the number of Reich citizens and their supporters continues to increase, with in particular the dissatisfaction of German citizenship being the most important factor. Namely, the dissatisfaction with the federal government, with the federal chancellor being the main target of dislike and hatred, who is also responsible for the refugee welcome culture.
Thanks. Then things can only get worse. Namely, both with the dissatisfaction and with the hatred of the German federal government, and thus especially with regard to Chancellor Angela Merkel.
That will actually be the case.
The Reich citizens and neo-Nazis in Germany and Switzerland, etc., as well as various other groupings, in the form of autonomous groups and self-governors, etc., in many other countries, are in my opinion nothing else but right-wing terrorists, who equate their terror in their hatred of the state and idiocy pathologically stupid and dumb with free and being free as well as freedom, etc. The machinations of the neo-Nazis at the end of the 1970s, and then at the beginning of the 1980s by a group of Reich citizens also had an effect on us, that is to say the FIGU, something you Playaran probably still remember. Just as Bernadette and I certainly do, because neo-Nazis and Reich citizens who had gone mad contacted us and thanked us for the fact that the FIGU would be on par with them. They came up with this crazy idea as a result of the association's name Free Community of Interest, because they were of the confused opinion that the term free was to be understood as autonomy, separated from the state. Consequently, the Free Community of Interest would be an autonomous group. We, of course, distance ourselves vehemently from this, and I have a particularly important word to say about it. Our association FIGU, that is to say the Free Universal Community of Interests, corresponds to an association based on the rule of law, which, like all FIGU association members, recognizes and follows Switzerland as a state, as well as its federal constitution and laws. The FIGU association and its members also recognize the historical facts in a consequent and comprehensive way. Thus, the existence of Switzerland as a state is in no way denied, the state not denigrated or negated, nor is the legitimacy of the basic laws called into question, because generally the decrees of the authorities and courts are accepted by the FIGU and its members. This also includes the necessary unavoidable state levies, such as taxes, etc. Thus, the FIGU Free Community of Interests is not based on an autonomous grouping, an autonomous state, or anything otherwise hostile to the state, and is also not willing to deviate from it. And this is and remains so, because the association FIGU preserves the free and the freedom in every righteous and legally state lawfully conforming and permitted way, which also its members in purely private capacity keep in such a way, which is by state law absolutely right. Thus, the FIGU association is integrated into the state of Switzerland, just as the association members are also included in the entire state order of Switzerland. The FIGU association does also not produce fantasy identity papers, etc., but only identity cards, etc., which are righteously only FIGU association related, just as in every respect only the money produced by the state is used as means of payment, and with it also the justified taxes are paid honestly, which contribute in every conceivable justified and necessary way to the preservation of the Swiss state. But as far as crazy autonomy groups are concerned, such as Reich citizens or individual autonomists, that is to say individual autonomous persons or other elements, groups and self-governing lunatics, etc., that are hostile to state and order. There are such not only in the form of Reich citizens, etc., in Germany, but also in Switzerland, whereby these autonomists and self-governing, etc., do not adhere to laws and denigrate the state under the rule of law as a joke. In Switzerland, too, a movement is steadily growing in this respect, whereby it resembles the German Reich citizens. Switzerland is also only an association as proclaimed. In addition, the Swiss Reich citizen sympathizers keep in contact with each other on the internet, whereby they provide instructions on Facebook on how willing Reich citizens lunatics can deregister from the state and become human. In a YouTube video, a certain Heino Fankhauser even gives instructions on how he returned his person to the state with a declaration on oath, and since then only wants to be addressed as human being Heino. From then on, he has only put his thumbprint and name in lowercase under documents. Swiss Reich citizens also use all kinds of self-made ID cards and fictitious car number plates, and drive around Switzerland with them, whereby they even prescribe to the authorities and courts that they may only judge people, but not human beings. This is probably to say that only persons who are part of the Swiss state may be judged, but not Reich citizens, because only these would be human beings, and had therefore to be named as such. These Reich citizens also proclaim that police law is not to be negotiated as being above human rights. Well, the Reich citizenship phenomenon is also active in Austria, where the Austrian state deniers call themselves freemen or are known as supporters of the One People's Public Trust OPP, who claim that they could run the state, although it must be said that there are also OPPT supporters in Switzerland. However, Austria also has to deal with an organization which calls itself the International Common Law Court of Justice Vienna ICCJV, which in addition has relocated its center to Switzerland and wants to establish a general jurisdiction with human, natural and international rights which should have precedence over the federal constitution. Also, a so-called sheriff association belongs to the ICCJV, which is registered in the Swiss Commercial Register as an association, whereby these sheriffs are supposed to carry charged weapons open or concealed, which is meant for execution of court orders, as it can be read on the ICCJV website. In this way, the Swiss arms laws are not supposed to be valid. This means that the ICCJV is also active in Switzerland, whereby one of its founders is the Swiss entrepreneur Daniel Model, who generates annual sales of around CHF 600 million as a manufacturer of packaging. In 2006, he also founded his own state, which he named Avalon, and for which he built a massive stone building, the Modelhof, where among other things lectures are given and calls for illegitimacy and alternatives to the state monopoly on the use of G-Vault and on the exercise of legal power. Reich citizens are therefore not only a national, but also an international phenomenon, and this also exists in many other countries. For example, in Australia, as well as in Denmark, for example, Christiana, but also in France, England, Canada, in the USA, Russia, as well as in various other countries. For the term Reich citizens, there is actually no generally accepted definition, just as there is no uniform movement or ideology in this regard. Effectively, individual groups are in part at odds with each other because their anti-state ideologies differ. Their pathologically confused thought construct consists of diverse and in itself unlogical right-wing extremist, racist, religious, sectarian, and anti-Semitic or wordly irrational ideologies, conspiracy theories, or esoteric senselessnesses. One thing, however, all male and female supporters of such imbecilic ideologies have in common, namely that they do not recognize the regular and constitutionally created states. For they all claim that the effective constitutional state would not exist rightfully, and that the folks would only be exploited by these bogus states, whereby the Reich citizens of all kinds consistently ignore and deny the historical facts. In addition, they demarcate their homes, houses, and their land, whereby extreme Reich citizens elements do in their delusion not shy away from defending their Reich with armed Gewalt, and from thereby accepting the death of others. Well, I think that if the existence of the constitutional home state is denied by Reich citizens elements, then also the legitimacy of basic laws is denied, just as decisions by authorities and courts are not accepted, no taxes or other state duties are paid, nor any state duties are fulfilled. Reich citizens of each facet establish their own governments, monarchies, and introduce kings, Reich officials, or Reich military. In addition, they print and also spend their own money, for example the angel money in Saxony-Anhalt, just as they also issue fantasy papers such as passports, driving licenses, and ID cards, etc., and try to authenticate themselves with them in the regular constitutional state. In this regard there are quite strange tendencies, such as, for example, a self-proclaimed king of Germany who is called Peter Fitzek by his real name and acts crazy with his own Reich and with his own currency. But what I would now also like to say about Chancellor Merkel's lack of intelligence and irresponsibility with regard to the induced refugee welcome culture which has lasted to this day and will continue in further future, from which practically all EU dictatorship states, including Switzerland, have been infected. The entire situation is not just being perpetuated by criminal smugglers alone. As you have already said several times privately, irresponsible rulers of the countries of refuge are colluding with the smugglers, and thereby also taking money from the refugees who have to pay their smugglers. So it is not only the smugglers of refugees who are exploiting the refugees for own gain, but also the irresponsible rulers who work with the smugglers. The refugee welcome culture of Merkel is very welcome to the concerned rulers of the refugee states. As you said, because all the refugees who seek the way to Europe, many of whom die, no longer burden their homeland with unemployment, poverty, criminality, felony, and various other problems. Of course, the irresponsible rulers of the refugee states are happy about this, because on the one hand, they do not have to deal with these problems any more or much less, while on the other hand, they nevertheless still get paid by the hired smugglers and thus profit horrendously. This, however, is done by the irresponsible leaders of the refugee states, secretly hiring smugglers and also promoting the flight practice of those who are willing to flee, especially the young human beings who flee their homeland because it gets drummed into them that they would be very welcome in Europe and could live in joy and glory. With deceitful promises they are encouraged to flee to Europe, which is secretly and extensively promoted by the state in the refugee states. of which, however, the big-mouthed rulers affected by stupidity, megalomania, greed for power and imperiousness, and all the false humanistic refugee rescuers have no idea and no knowledge whatsoever. That is why they themselves, too, are in their ignorance, doing all they can to further promote the flow of refugees, and to make the smugglers and their irresponsible backers in the governments of the refugee countries, which become richer and richer, while on the other hand, many refugees who pay horrendous sums to the smugglers die on the arduous routes to Europe.
I have already spoken about this several times, but this has in fact only ever been in private, which is why it is probably good that you mention these facts at one point in an official conversation. Which I too could have done, but which was never the case, because other facts always had to be discussed. But as far as your computer work is concerned, I would like to say first that we will only have official conversations again when you no longer have any complaints, because with regard to your injury, overexertion is not advantageous. That must be enough if you retrieve and write down this conversation today. So we will keep everything the same as before. Just that we only visit you for short periods of time and only have conversations of a personal nature, which must be registered by us, but not called up by you and not recorded. Then you should now explain to Quetzal the facts concerning your accident, after which he will once again have to discuss a few things with you in the field. Whereby I also want to be present because I am interested in the work that has to be done, which he has to explain, and which is then to be done under your direction.
First of all, I want to say that I have been trying to work with the computer on and off for weeks. Admittedly, the whole thing is extremely painful, because every little wrong movement, which unfortunately happens again and again, makes me see the fire in Holland or the stars in infinity, as I also often type wrongly, because it is difficult to coordinate the hand and the fingers and the arm correctly due to the pain and the severely limited mobility. So it will take me quite some time to retrieve the interview report and write it down. However, the repetitive work and efforts on the computer have been successful, as have my personal therapy exercises. On the 20th of July, after another X-ray, even the head doctor at the hospital was surprised at the success of these exercises and explained that even if an operation had been performed, the whole thing would not have looked any better. This, he probably meant if I had survived the operation, but he did not say this openly. I would also like to clarify all the important matters concerning the group, which I have sent to you via Florina, so that you can work through them and also discuss them in detail in the committee. We have our regular General Assembly next weekend, at which I will have to present your decisions and advice.
To talk about it and to clarify everything, that is of course important, but Ptah has to report on it, because that is his duty. So I will be patient and wait, because I am also interested in what else you have to bring up, to hear what you have to say afterwards regarding your accident.
What I have to explain on the part of the body in terms of advice and decisions regarding the FIGU guidelines and statutes, the FIGU premises and the concern of, and the related safety conditions, insurances and responsibility, etc., as well as in terms of and the related possibilities and impossibilities, etc., I will gladly explain before explaining your accident. Also, with regard to a FIGU site, free and freedom must also be upheld in this regard, as was stated earlier with regard to the forestation and use of FIGU land for non-FIGU purposes, as a result of which such a request had to be rejected by the General Assembly, as must equally be the case with regard to the request from.
You are explaining that the whole thing would be an outside use on FIGU property, as is the case with regard to forestry and supervision. Anyway, that's how I understand your elaboration.
You have understood correctly. But my explanations will also take some time, although you should not write them down, but only keep them in your mind and reproduce them verbally at the GV. Therefore, hear now what councils and resolutions have been passed by the board and are to be brought to bear, which, very strictly speaking, correspond to the guidelines of the Free Universal Interest Group, whereby the free is to be considered and understood in the strict sense that the free and the freedom of the FIGU, that is to say, Free Universal Interest Group, must be preserved in every case and in every way, and must also be spread in the world and preserved under all conceivable circumstances. The free and freedom applies to the FIGU Association and the missionary work, all other work and activities, as well as to the individual core group members and passive members, etc., in every conceivable respect, so that coercion and violence may never be demanded or exercised, but always and only the free, freisen, and freedom must be in the foreground and must be given without restriction in every case. This also means that all work to be done by FIGU members in the FIGU Association must be carried out in a voluntary or free manner and absolutely free of charge. Consequently, the freedom and freelessness of the FIGU Association also require that the free universal community of interests may not issue any membership or association-related employment contracts, just as no membership or association-related remuneration may be made in connection with employment contracts. According to the respective FIGU General Assembly resolution, work orders and work commitments requiring financial compensation may only be issued to self-employed workers, that is to say, to workers who are not FIGU members, and non-financial work order and work compensation may also be paid to them. Such external work orders and work commitments can, of course, also be issued to independent FIGU, external companies of FIGU members, and they can also be remunerated for the order and work compensation incurred. But now to the previously mentioned facts, advice, guidelines, and resolutions, the following explanations, whereby at the next General Assembly it should be made clear that the following should be rewritten and introduced into the statutes and bylaws. Now, what is to be explained in detail about everything, I will put into words as follows.
Thanks for your comments. Please pass on my thanks and those of the core group to the panel. The advice and decisions help us a lot, because with everything, things have now also become clearer that needed to be explained in more detail.
But there are other things, such as emergency procedures, which are not listed in the bylaws, but which the General Assembly will be confronted with soon, and which will then be acted upon.
Like what?
It will be about issues in Australia, namely, and you will have to take a stand on this, which will only be effective locally, but as before, will not be made public to the outside world, but will remain an emergency act.
All right, then the question? How do you play and assess sanctions that are taken and implemented against other states, as practiced in particular by the EU dictatorship in the USA against Russia?
Such action and doing is absurd and politically reprehensible.
Sanctions as a political weapon correspond to an attitude as sneaky, despicable, and degenerate as any kind of acts of war. If I may use your words, I would also like to say in this regard that political as well as other sanctions are stupid, primitive, and lunatic, and prove that the originators of such machinations are despotic, irresponsible elements who have a very horrendous lack of intellect, rationality, and intelligence, and thus also of a real, healthy, and righteous way in terms of a capacity for governing. Also, punitive tariffs as a political weapon against trade goods of foreign states, as imposed by Trump on various states, who is unfit for the office of U.S. President and should be removed from office, correspond to a primitive, intellectually deficient, irrational, and intelligence-poor way of acting and reprehensible reprisals. It has been proved since time immemorial that sanctions of any kind, so also punitive tariffs, etc., have never been a means of settling any differences between different states or even of bringing about good understanding and peace between them. On the contrary, through the fault of irresponsible contracting and megalomaniacal rulers and governors, only increased rejection, discord, difficulties, trade wars, as well as hatred, revenge, and ultimately insurrectionary armies, acts of terrorism and wars among countries have resulted. However, these have always been fought not by the fallible female or male rulers, but by the populations and armies, who have provoked wars through the delusion of power and the irresponsibility of the people in power and their high-handedness. And since the peoples and the armies never stood up to the government criminal and completely irresponsible and criminal machinations of the rulers of every kind, and did not refuse to take up arms and commit war murder, the whole thing has been maintained up to the present time and is being continued in an unchanged manner. And as long as the populations and armies of all countries do not refuse to engage in acts of war against alleged enemies, but on the contrary comply with the warmongering and peace-preventing activities of the ruling power-obsessed, and advocate and engage in acts of war, so long can no real peace and no effective freedom arise on earth and among all its humanity. What is the case in practically all states throughout the world at the present time, under the majority of inadequate, anti-peace and anti-people, conscienceless, irresponsible and power-obsessed leaderships of those in power in very many areas does not correspond in any way to any form of peace, freedom, and justice, either for them or for their populations. On the contrary, the whole thing corresponds only to a state of threat in the form of a dangerous and dubious tranquility which threatens to break at any moment and can lead to armed conflicts, wars, or at least to long-lasting hostile differences between the countries and thus also between the populations. And the fact that the populations, who in any case are always the ones who effectively suffer the most, howl along with the wolves of power of their governments, who conjure up everything evil and bad in the name of the peoples, results from the fact that the masses of the populations, as a result of their unconsciousness, lack of education, and inertia, are themselves incapable of questioning anything, of thinking for themselves, and of deciding and acting in the correct way. The fact is that the peoples, without being able to form their own rational and reasoned opinion, allow themselves to be lulled without hesitation by the suggestive lies, promises of lies and the like of all those fallible rulers, whereby these fallible rulers form the bulk of all rulers and co-rulers in all states of the earth, who create strife, discord, and lack of freedom, both in their own country and in other states. And as long as Earth humans continue to live in this weak state of consciousness and do not begin to think, consider and act for themselves, but leave everything to the wrongly deciding, wrongly acting, and high-handed rulers, nothing will change for the better. The whole mass of Earth humans must at last find for themselves the right path to peace and freedom, first to themselves and then to the whole of Earth humans, as is shown, described and taught in many ways by the teaching of truth. Teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, in relation to the personal thinking, decision-making, and action of the individual with regard to action.
I can only agree with this and hope that your words will find their way into the ears, minds, and reason of Earthlings. But if that will really be the case, it will only be in the distant future, if the great catastrophe you have announced sweeps away the majority of Earthlings. Unfortunately, it will be the case that the majority of Earth humans will continue not to learn the effective truth of life and existence, but will continue to vegetate thoughtlessly and want to err with regard to real reality for as long as they live. Hence, it will also be that the majority of human beings on Earth will continue to cheer and emulate all those erroneous and confused suggestive speeches, lies, deceptions, and false promises of the autocratic, government-unfit, irresponsible rulers. In the process, everything lying and criminal is also done to suppress and deny the real, effective reality and its truth, which could and would lead to a change for the good and the best, and into a future of effective worldwide peace, true freedom, and justice. Of course, I do not only mean the teaching of Nocodemian, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, which is spread by the Figu Association and myself, but also any other good and correct teaching of any Earthlings who have gained their own truthful knowledge concerning life, the environment, existence, the universe, consciousness, spirit, energy, mind, reason, and intelligence, as well as especially the relevant human behavior, and who spread their valuable knowledge among the human beings of the earth. And it is indeed the case that many earthlings have since time immemorial repeatedly gained and spread good, positive and valuable knowledge, also with regard to spiritual teachings, but as a result of the ignorance of the peoples and their oppression by the rulers of the religions and sects as well as rulers and state powers, not much of it could really penetrate, and therefore bring about only a few positive changes. This is also true of all that is good, correct and true, which is undoubtedly also taught in many different religions and sects, etc. Although all religious sectarian posturing is excluded from real reality and its truth, in particular all the nonsense of imaginary forms, such as a god or deities, a son of God, divine prophets, divine saints, angels and devils, etc. But what I want to say about what you have said about sanctions and punitive tariffs is that I share your view about punitive tariffs. When such tariffs are levied on trade goods, as the U.S. ruler or the crazy lying presidential oaf Trump is doing against other states with regard to various trade goods, then the trade exchange economy is disadvantaged. By imbecilically levying punitive tariffs, certain trade goods are made much more expensive, just as business people and consumers are also exploited by punitive tariffs levied by government-incapable pathological imbeciles, which amounts to a sheer irresponsible act of terrorism. And the fact that the oaf Trump, whose orders, actions, deeds, speeches and governance correspond to those of a 6-year-old boy, is of course completely indifferent, and that with his idiotic actions and deeds he is also working against his own country. That is to say, the USA is creating enmity in various states, is something that he does not understand and, in his weakness of intelligence, is also unable to grasp, as are his advisors and all the others in his circle of government and the supporters from the people of the USA who support him. For my part, I have thought about this pompous and undignified guy, whereby I assess him in such a way that he is on the one hand megalomaniac and on the other hand domineering, as it is written in the dictionary. Furthermore, I can recognize in his whole behavior and conduct a serious defect of mind, reason and intelligence, although I cannot ascertain whether this defect of consciousness, coupled with a certain amount of imbecility, is congenital or whether he acquired it himself in his early childhood or adolescence as a result of his great stupidity and emotional disability. His intelligence defect, which is clearly evident to me, and his inconsistency with regard to his own statements and instructions, etc., also reveal his absurd and foolish behavior, as well as his fickleness and lying, as well as his constant changing and revoking of given instructions, and the respective thoughtless, vehement, and quick denial of negative facts which are made known about him, his behavior, actions, and deeds. In my opinion, this man is dominated by an obsession with himself, as well as by a cognitive distortion of his personality and an overestimation of his own skills and competencies. As is unfortunately the case worldwide with many female and male government leaders of all colors, he is an element of extreme form in terms of almost boundless self-overestimation, self-congratulation, self-aggrandizement, and even self-glorification, which is particularly expressed when he signs decrees, etc., and provocatively raises them in the presence of a large group of people who admire him and demonstratively exposes them for the spectators and journalists. For me, however, a loss of reality is also recognizable. And in addition, everything is also characterized in such a way that I would like to call it hubris, a self-conceit, presumption and haughtiness, arrogance and presumptuousness. The whole of Trump's personality is also connected to a loss of reality in that he has overestimated his own abilities, achievements and competencies, as is usually the case with persons who hold positions of power, especially in government positions, but also in positions of civil servants and superiors, although these human beings, including Trump, are not aware of this fact. Such persons can also be found among all kinds of other potentates. That is to say, rulers, leaders, spokespersons, territorial leaders, regents, chiefs, headmen, commanders, holders of power, holders of authority, country leaders, bosses, commanders, and emperors. The elements falling into this round dance live under a delusion in which they believe themselves to be a very important personality, and in this way are addicted to gigantomania and megalomania, but they also live under the delusion that they must and would surpass their fellow human beings in their striving for and acting in power by exaggerated achievements, which is not usually the case because such persons turn out to be rather human rivets and zeros.
You have had good training and learnt much from my father Svath, dear friend, which is why you are well versed in psychoanalysis. Therefore, you judge and call this man's conduct, mind, reason, and intelligence in a correct manner, namely that there is a certain pathological imbecility in him, that is to say, a consciousness-related disability in the form of a persistent state of clearly below-average cognitive abilities, as well as associated limitations in his affective behavior, which is predominantly determined by short, impulse-like emotional impulses and not by cognitive processes.
Thanks for your opinion, but I do not want to shine with what I have learnt of this kind with Svath, which is why I basically hold back in this regard towards the human beings of Earth, and do not bring up such things. Maybe it will be good if I just leave out what was said when I recall and transcribe the conversation and just make a few dots.
No, you should not, because your psychoanalytical assessment gets to the heart of what needs to be said about Donald Trump as an assessment.
That is also my opinion. Because this man is not only stupid and incapable as a leader, but also uneducated and absolutely unpredictable in his megalomania, self-importance, and half-baked mind and lack of reason. As I have studied the practices of the U.S. presidents and still deal with them today, I can only say that degenerations of character, lack of understanding and reason, as well as illogical, low and primitive forms, as well as underhanded hostility, strife, and war-making degenerations, such as are peculiar to Trump, were also inherent in other U.S. presidents in a different way. An undeniable fact, which often led to wars, political assassinations, government overthrows in foreign states, as well as many other serious monstrosities being triggered and carried out by the U.S. government. U.S. intelligence services and U.S. military, which also gave rise to terrorist organizations, such as Al-Qaeda and the IS or Islamist State, through the fault of U.S. policy and its machinations. And all this has been happening since time immemorial, since the United States of America has existed, because the majority of all politicians and government officials as well as their presidents have been power-obsessed and completely irresponsible elements since the beginning of the USA. As such, they were, and Trump is also, unrestrainedly addicted to amorality, malice and unconscionability, as well as an uncontrollable lack of restraint, indecency, irresponsibility, nefariousness, mindlessness, ruthlessness, and unscrupulousness. This also lacks any honesty, order, any sense of peace, freedom, and righteousness. However, if I take the floor now, I must now return to what Ptah raised regarding a new controversy, as well as the possibility of new perfidious offensives against you, and possibly the core group members. Because I am responsible for making security efforts and working out certain security measures, which we keep under control according to our directives with permitted means. We will make every effort to do what is necessary, and we will also do it in the future as long as it is necessary. Certain precautions to be carried out I will now explain to you, whereby there are also things to be done in the center compound, which are to be carried out, after which I will then check the corresponding executions in due course. However, this is not to be discussed openly, neither now nor later, and thus nothing is to be recorded by you in writing, for measures are to be observed that will be of great importance, namely with regard to the possibility. Therefore, these are to be carried out from today until 3 weeks at the latest, namely, furthermore, the following further measures such as are also to be taken, which unfortunately, it is unavoidable that, because threatening attacks must be expected again, whereby which must be prevented. So appropriate precautions have to be taken, which give a certain security that already attempts of attack will be prevented. Therefore,
if with these precautions to be taken by us and with your various efforts mentioned by you with regard to, then it should really be with besides.
That can be assumed. However, The reason why this new controversy is being sought is based on two important factors, namely, firstly, the maliciousness of fighting against that which generally brings personal progress to Earth humans with regard to becoming truly human, the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life. This teaching, however, is prevented by all means of lies, deceit, and slander, mainly by the leaders and believers of religions and sects, but also by politics, and thus also by secret governmental machinations. The teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, which you bring, teach and spread, and which can indisputably bring to Earth humans their very own life according to positive creational laws, as well as real interpersonal peace and freedom and thus good interpersonal relationships, is the most valuable teaching ever brought and taught to Earth for the revolution of consciousness in relation to true humanity, and is now being taught anew. It was indeed brought and taught in ancient times, but it was maliciously falsified by misunderstanding Earth humans, and false religions and sects were created from it, from which a great deal of evil and mischief has been produced up to the present time. Unfortunately, this will also continue to be the case in the far future, because the malicious power of the religions, sects, and their representatives, who may be believers, but are nevertheless irresponsible, continue to vehemently promote the fanaticism-induced faith of the sanctimonious, uncritical, naive, and clueless followers of the faith. Thereby, through suggestive influencing powers of faith-promoting elements of various kinds, helpless faith-label persons, who are searching for real truth of life and for a real expansion of their consciousness, are unhesitatingly and irresponsibly seduced into new believers and driven into religious and sectarian fanaticism and delusion. The second malignant factor in the new controversy being sought is to nip in the bud your and the Figus and their members' efforts in relation to the disastrous consequences of overpopulation and to slander them as lies, conspiracy theories, nonsense, fantasy, and do-gooder theories. There are already corresponding activities and defamatory undertakings in this regard, which are intended to prevent your open dissemination of the truth, and thus also to name the truth of the actual causes of climate change, the destruction of nature, fauna, and flora, and of the planet itself. So the irresponsible machinations of excessive overpopulation are to be concealed or at least trivialized, which are to blame for all the natural catastrophes, destructions, and the death of many Earth humans that are already occurring worldwide and are steadily getting worse and worse. But this also obscures and even deliberately prevents the truth that all planetary reasonableness with regard to a human population that is ideally sustainable for the Earth has long since been exceeded by a factor of 16. Furthermore, it is also concealed because it is not to be recognized and also not to be known that the unstoppably increasing brutality, violence, indifference, lack of conscience, the murdering, killing, terrorizing, the compulsions and the warfare, as well as the entire criminality and the criminal system in the entire earthly humanity are constantly increasing and becoming more precarious and degenerating more and more. Already in the families, through wrong and miseducation, the causes begin to form, to shape the offspring for all kinds of degenerations, which ultimately also bring malicious negative effects on the environment, nature, its fauna and flora, and the planet itself. And in this respect, everything increases and worsens in such a way that the wrongly and miseducated offspring themselves also carelessly produce and bring into the world offspring who then, also like their parents, in relation to the real reality and truth, with their degenerating, criminal, and felonious machinations, also ruthlessly bring death, extinction, destruction, and annihilation in nature, fauna, and flora, and also promote them more and more. Furthermore, it is a given that organized groups hostile to order, peace, and freedom, and also elements acting in the governments, are creating new challenges and divergences, with lies, deceit, defamatory hostilities, hatred, envy and speculation, and contradictions based on paradoxes, as well as all kinds of malicious machinations, are intended to mislead Earth humans, thereby impairing their intellect and reason and preventing human beings from creating peace and freedom within themselves and between peoples. Basically, Earth humans should not find the way to real reality and truth, because only by being beguiled in their entire mass by lies, deceit, violence, and coercion, which is especially the case through the suggestive whisperings of faith by those in power, rulers and leaders of religions and sects, but also by the falseness and self-importance of the fallible leaders of power in politics, the Earth humans can be enchantingly easily directed as the bulk of the masses, held down and kept under control in religious, sectarian, and political expediency. In this way, Earth humans have been directed, ruled, governed, persuaded and commanded, kept under supervision and monitored by the majority of rulers and representatives of religions, sects, and politicians and ruling powers of all colors since time immemorial. In the process, everything that has kept the power of the religions and sects, respectively their rulers and representatives, as well as the politicians, rulers, and those in power alive, and also continues to keep them alive, has been surreptitiously promoted with all malicious lies, false promises, and machinations. And this has been able to happen since time immemorial, as it is also the case today, because the peoples, on the one hand, do not free themselves from their religious, sectarian delusion and do not turn to the real reality and truth, and not to the fact that they themselves alone are and possess that power and might, through which they make every decision themselves and carry out every action on their own responsibility, and likewise perform every deed according to their own will, and that without a deity doing this for them or being able to do so, because all deities correspond to nothing other than morbid, stupid imaginings of the believers. On the other hand, the same principle applies in a modified way to politics, rulers and governors, etc., because the peoples themselves usually elect their rulers, leaders and rulers, so that they are also responsible for what their elected rulers do, how they act, govern, and thus exercise their governmental office and power potential as a whole. In this way, however, it has been the case from time immemorial that the peoples, in their ignorance and lack of knowledge of human nature, etc., and without knowledge of human nature, etc., elected and acclaimed their rulers, state leaders and rulers, without recognizing their intentions. Consequently, in every case, only urge, violence and coercion resulted from everything, as is also still the case, because the people, in their stupidity, lack of knowledge of human nature and ignorance, elect the wrong persons to positions of government and power. After that, discontent, strife, and finally uprisings and acts of violence arise from the whole thing, from which the peoples then have to suffer. Whereby, however, they themselves have elected their oppressive rulers and brought them into their positions, to which you once said in a comparison that stupid calves choose their butchers themselves. Through all that I have explained so far, it is absolutely impossible for individual Earth humans and for the whole of Earth humanity to find the way to peace, freedom, truth, justice, and to knowledge that is in accordance with reality, either intrinsically within themselves or within society and the mass of the whole of humanity. In fact, everything is to be prevented also with regard to good interpersonal relations, as well as with regard to peace and freedom in uniting friendships, deep relations, and between the different peoples among themselves. If peace and freedom were to come about in the Earth humans themselves, and thereby also in all peoples, then the religions would lose power among their believers, and their false teachings would become useless, because the believers would inevitably recognize that the Earth human being alone is master of himself, as well as of his thoughts, feelings, decisions, actions, and deeds, and not a god or other supposedly divine savior. Every political disunity, The non-thinking of the people, as well as the opinions propagated and suggested by the ruling rulers, must comprehensively take hold of the people and become their own. Consequently, they must be maintained by all means, and thus secure their positions for that part of the unrighteous rulers who act against the good of their peoples, harass them in many ways, and enrich themselves pecuniarily to their detriment, which leads to hatred and envy, etc. Hatred, envy, and slander have no expiry date when it comes to preventing something that is real, good, and valuable, such as the doctrine of truth, doctrine of the Spirit, doctrine of life which you teach and spread, and through which love, peace, freedom, equality, and justice can arise in earth humans themselves and be spread throughout the entire earth population. To prevent the spread of this teaching, and thus your work and mission in this respect, is to be the purpose of the controversy, which is again to be brought into being by religious believers, envious people, know-it-alls, as well as by certain authoritative authorities and other adversaries throughout the world, namely by inventing untrue circumstances about you and accusing you of lies and deceitfulness through various machinations. So again, slander and falsehood shall arise that your film and photo material concerning our flying apparatus shall be forgery, swindling, charlatanry, swindling, and even maleficence. This, as before, is to be connected with malicious and insidious provocations of every conceivable kind in relation to your personality, especially attacks which could also endanger your safety again, but under certain circumstances also that of your family and the Figu Club members. So, malicious disparagement, belittling, ridiculing, denigrating, defaming, insulting, and discriminating will continue to take place. And in this regard, everything will be kept alive and continue until far into the future. Consequently, these intrigues will lead to a never-ending spiral full of untruths, and will be continuously preserved until far into the future. For our part, although we will endeavor to control all these defamatory and also threatening activities, etc., as far as possible, as decided by our committee, we cannot give any guarantee that certain attacks will fall outside our control. Furthermore, it must be explained that by spreading ever more intensely and extensively increasing and fanatically degenerating faith lies and faith deceptions by sectarian religious believers worldwide, earth humans are to be prevented from finding themselves and recognizing that it is not a God or any other higher power that has to decide on personal actions and deeds, etc., but only the human being alone in every way and manner. Thus, in the present and in the coming times, believers afflicted with religious delusion will again push up the old-fashioned lies and deceptions of faith with renewed efforts to drive earth humans once more into a religious faith, and thus into a state which, as in earlier times, can bring evil degenerations. Connected with this is also the addiction to power and the greed for profit of many rulers and business tycoons, etc., who irresponsibly know how to use the delusion of faith of countless earth humans and fanatize them, whereby in particular an increase in the readiness to use violence and the exercise of violence arises, which moreover also increases in relation to the unrestrainedly excessive growth of earth human overpopulation. And this readiness to use violence and violence of all kinds, which already begins with verbal violence in the upbringing of children, and in the course of life degenerates into physical and deadly violence, has for some time now been gaining the upper hand worldwide. The whole thing begins in the family and continues to spread throughout Earth human being society, especially in politics, in the actions of the security forces, the military, as well as in the actions of superiors, etc., and of course especially in religions and sects, where the violent powers of many religious representatives do not shy away from rape, threats, and much more evil. The mass of Earth human overpopulation has risen to almost 9 billion since your foreboding warnings to the rulers and media, etc., which you wrote worldwide in the 1940s and 1950s, when the Earth humans did not yet amount to 3 billion, whereby the factor of that has already been exceeded by which the steadily increasing readiness for violence and exercise of violence of the Earth humans could still be controlled and prevented. In fact, the future will show that the readiness to use violence and its exercise will continue to spread in an unimagined way and in many different forms throughout the entire society of all peoples, and will bring a great deal of suffering, death, disaster, and destruction, and will no longer be able to be contained. In this way, however, it will not only be the terrorist cells, which for decades have brought disaster and destruction as well as torture, massacres and many deaths, misery and hardship upon Earth humans, because everything of this kind is now inexorably spreading more and more. Therefore, it will increasingly be innumerable degenerate individuals, as well as elements of the normal bourgeois Earth population gathering together in small or larger groups, who will in future more frequently and brutally commit violence in public in an ever more unhesitating and uncontrolled manner. And indeed much worse than has been the case for years in increasing measure, with which fear, terror, suffering, distress, damage, and tribulation will be spread among many righteous Earth humans.
English translation 709th Contact Part 2. Sunday the 29th of July 2018, 1:41 hours.
Okay, then the matter is clear to me that your orders will be carried out. Consequently, we need not discuss it further. However, if it is possible, I would have a few things to say about all that has been said so far, as well as a few more questions, if you have time to answer them.
There is really no hurry for us. Consequently, you can put forward your questions.
Good, thanks, but what I want to say will take some time. Though I want to ask first, Ptah, what your scriptural and linguistic experts explain regarding my question whether in German usage, Soll or Soll is correct.
I asked about this and received the answer that according to your question, it is not Solle but Soll that is correct. The basic root forms from the German, from which the German language emerged, have four should forms, which are also valid in German, namely Soll, Sollte, Sollen, and Gesollt, whereby the last leading type is based on the past tense of hatte and hatte. Consequently, the forms hat gesollt, hatte gesollt, and hatte gesollt are correct. Soll corresponds to an incorrect form of expression, which is wrong in the German language, and consequently, only Soll is correct if a sentence ends with it or a corresponding sentence insertion with Soll is given. The following sentence serves as an example. Something should only be correct if everything is also as it should be in the end. It was explained that a should never be used, because in the German language, which originated from the German, only a shall is correct, and therefore only such a shall can and should be used. A should is always wrong in any case, and thus falsifies the clear German verbal language and the equally clear German written language.
Good, thanks. Then I always have things to explain about you, Pleiaren, and the connections with you. It just never ends with my explanations that I have to give that you, Pleiaren, come from your space-time structure, Ankar universe, as you call your dimension, and that you only come to our Dern universe, and you are active there only in the SOL system, that is to say also only on Earth, but nowhere else in our entire Dern universe. Again and again I must also explain that when it is said that your peoples are also to be found with the Lyra, the Pleiaren, or beyond the galaxy sun or the Milky Way, etc., that this does not mean the stars and constellations in our Dern universe, but just such in your Ankar universe or Ankar space-time structure. And if celestial bodies in our space-time structure are mentioned as positions from which you can be found beyond, then it should finally be understood that this refers to your space-time structure, but unfortunately this is misunderstood again and again. It is also misunderstood again and again that when we speak of a space-time structure and a universe, we are only talking about the fourth matter belt and one of the 7 energy belts in creation. This explains that the universe is not the creation, so consequently, the creation is not the universe. Creation itself has 7 dimensions with 7 energy belts each, of which only one belt, the fourth, exists in each dimension as a matter belt, which is called the universe by the Earthlings, whereby the Earthlings must first be laboriously made to understand that the universe they call the material belt is only the seventh part of one dimension of the 7 dimensions of creation. In this matter belt, precisely in this universe called by Earthlings, past, present, and future alone exist. This means that in the matter belts alone, past, present, and future dimensions or space-time structures are given in multiple forms and in endless numbers. While in the 7 dimensions of creation as such, as they are each arranged in the egg-shaped creation as a separate unit, there is only one single dimension, or one single space-time structure. These are therefore the 7 creational dimensions which prevail in the egg-shaped creation itself, and which in turn have 7 energy belts within them, whereby one of each of the 7 energy belts has a material belt in which uncountable dimensions or space-time structures of the past, present, and future exist.
To this, I think it is to be borne in mind that all those Earth humans who bring forward corresponding questions to you, as well as the entire Earth Human Guild of Astronomical Sciences, are in this respect not included in the education which my father Svath has bestowed upon you concerning creation and its dimensions, as well as universes and space-time structures, as well as the past, present, and future.
But it is still tedious to be pestered again and again with these questions, which are, after all, really only knowledge-based, but not consciousness evolution-based, and thus also not of a spirit teaching, aka creation energy-based matter.
That is probably also correct, but...
Of course, I know that as a rule, sheer curiosity is confused with a thirst for knowledge, but in the process precisely that which is fundamentally of importance and significance, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, or the teaching of the spirit, comes short, is given short shrift.
Then you know the score.
Yes, and with that I now also come to what I want to say and elaborate a little on all that was said before. And with regard to numbers and all kinds of other data and values, I will refer back to what we discussed together in a private way. So I will begin as follows with what I want to bring up and say. The number of overpopulation that has degenerated on Earth can no longer be denied, which is absolutely a cause for concern regarding the continued existence of Earth humans, the whole of nature, its fauna and flora, and even the planet. Simply as a result of the already widespread indifference to one another and the lack of reasonable communication and entertainment, the human beings of the Earth have grown apart. And through the needs, thirst, hunger, and desires of the Earthlings for luxury, mobility, and security, they have already irrevocably depleted the planet through intensive exploitation of all conceivable materials, such as rare earths, petroleum, gold, silver, coal, various ores, precious stones, as well as gases, etc., to such an extent that no regeneration is possible in the long term. The majority of all agricultural land worldwide is also in an extremely poor condition, with more than 40% of the once fertile land and its soils being severely to very severely impaired by acidification and chemical pollution, erosion, salinisation, and compaction, and being steadily more destroyed. And this also through overbuilding in terms of dwellings for the inexorably growing and already overwhelming overpopulation, through which inexorably more and more destructive and devastating machinations are being devised and exercised against nature, fauna, flora, and the planet itself. Erosion not only degrades the quality of natural foodstuffs, but also promotes the slow desertification and infertility of soils, ultimately creating desertification, through which much or all agricultural productivity is very much reduced or plummets to zero. In view of the still rampant development of overpopulation, it is the case that Earth humans today actually need 16 Earths of the same kind in order to satisfy the carrying and nourishing capacity of the planet with regard to human beings, which, given the nature of a planet, as is the case with the Earth, is to be calculated at 529 million. Only in this way, if earthly humanity had 16 such planets at its disposal and to exist on, could it continue as before, and even then only until overpopulation would arise again and a new planet would have to be sought for population. In view of the continued unreasonable and irresponsible population growth by Earthlings and their endlessly increasing demands, even if increased natural crop yields could be achieved by any new measures, there would already be more new planets needed to meet the Earth's limit of 529 million inhabitants. The fact is that the consequences of excessive overpopulation do not only affect their nutrition, but also specifically the health of the Earth's human beings, whose population on the 31st of December in 2017 was exactly 8844128002 or 8.844 billion Earth humans, while according to false earthly calculation assumptions, there are about 1 billion human beings less. Air pollution alone kills more than 7 million human beings every year, while about 1 billion human beings have only extremely poor sanitation, and more than another billion have no access to clean drinking water. It is also a fact that half of the world's population, that is to say well over 4.3 billion human beings, suffer from water scarcity, and in each of these cases, the number will continue to grow in the future in relation to the unchecked, blatant increase in overpopulation. It is already the case today that in some places drinking water supplies are already being stretched much more than they can recover and be used. The problem of housing is also becoming more and more precarious, because the uncontrollably growing overpopulation is already bringing about a development that is almost impossible to cope with, which is also connected with enormous financial resources, the necessary building sites, and all kinds of other difficulties. Many human beings live in extremely miserable conditions on the streets of cities in Europe, such as slab pushers, clochards, and other homeless people in Germany, Switzerland, France, Italy, and England, etc., while almost 2 billion more live in need, misery, and poverty in the slums of large cities, such as in Cape Town, Karachi, Lagos, Bombay/Mumbai, Nairobi, New Delhi, and Mexico City, whereby also in this respect the number will increase in relation to the still increasing overpopulation worldwide. The fact is and will remain that the more human beings populate the Earth, the more the desire for prosperity, pleasure, and financial and material wealth will increase, which in turn will lead to more crime, but also to increasing envy towards wealthier people, and to more frequent and more degenerating violence. Furthermore, population growth will also lead to more degenerating machinations that destroy nature, fauna, flora, and the climate, precisely in relation to the massively increasing worldwide overpopulation, which currently amounts to about 110 million human beings annually, in addition to the accounting of all annual deaths. If everything is considered carefully, then the growing number of Earth humans or the mass of the inexorably increasing overpopulation on Earth results in the worst threat to Earth humans of all times, whereby this threat, which hangs like a sword of Damocles over the future of the entire Earth population, naturally also affects the existence of nature, its fauna and flora, as well as the planet itself. And this threat is exacerbated by the rapid increase in overpopulation since the 1950s, with its worldwide destructive machinations in nature, fauna, flora, and the planet on top of it, whereby climate change as a catastrophic consequence of human irrationality brings further immense destruction and devastation, as well as endless misery and suffering to Earth humans. And all this can no longer be brought under control and can no longer be stopped, not even by loud-mouthed scientists, climate researchers, and politicians, etc., making stupid big speeches, pretending to understand and making themselves important. And they do this, although they understand nothing of the whole of the catastrophe that is already underway and spreading, because they do not even realize how badly and already hopelessly the whole doom has progressed and become an irreparable fiasco and disaster, which causes misfortune upon misfortune, and continually brings more and more unsolvable problems. And these problems, which have never appeared since the very first coming into being and existence of the human beings of the Earth up to the present day, have already grown to such an extent at the present time that they can no longer be overcome. And this is because the majority of human beings on Earth, as well as all types of government officials and their advisors and lobbyists, as well as the religious leaders and their helpers, sociologists, etc., lack the intellect, reason, and intelligence to perceive and recognize the actual reality and its truth, namely how devastatingly bad things really are on planet Earth, its nature, fauna, flora, atmosphere, and climate. Out of this blindness of not perceiving and not seeing, as well as not recognizing the effective facts with regard to all the destructions in all conceivable relationships in nature, on the planet, on the waters of all kinds, on fauna and flora, on the land, on the atmosphere, and on the climate, which have been catastrophically rampant on Earth for decades, the truth is still not recognized. In this regard, the blame for the catastrophe that has been rampant for decades and is becoming more and more precarious is founded, which has not even been recognized as such by those responsible for all earthly state leaderships, as well as by the scientists and experts and politicians, etc., responsible for it, and is still not recognized today. The fact is that up to the present time, all these experts and scientists, as well as the responsible state, rulers and politicians have time and again put forward and enacted only flimsy and stupid proposals and absolutely inadequate stupid measures for alleged climate protection, etc., which, however, are still not recognized as such. Which, however, in their senselessness are not even worth as much as a drop on a hot stone that at least still evaporates. While all the bullshit of the politicians, rulers, scientists, climate researchers, and experts, etc., is not even able to produce a thin skin. This is precisely because they, in their lack of understanding, their lack of reason and their lack of intelligence, do not recognize that the reason for the entire catastrophe, which they also do not recognize as such in their real reality and cannot grasp, lies in the existing and still endlessly growing overpopulation. Well, the enormous quantities of greenhouse gases that have been blown into the atmosphere since the beginning of industrialization continue to increase uncontrollably every year because the ever-growing Earth humans demand more and more industrialization in order to create more and more products of all kinds that are needed and demanded by the mass of the uncontrollably increasing overpopulation. And this further industrialization, on the other hand, inevitably produces more greenhouse gases and cascades of dirt that are hurled into the atmosphere. And this in addition to the fact that every year millions of Earthlings who come of age also inevitably use more vehicles with explosion engines and other dirty vehicles of all kinds, and thus increase the total level of greenhouse gases enormously. Consequently, more and more exhaust gases are constantly polluting and harassing the atmosphere, rendering all inadequate plans of scientists, climatologists, and other experts to avert further damage due to global warming, etc., futile and completely useless before appropriate measures can even be conceived, let alone implemented. The effective carrying and nourishing capacity of planet Earth is calculated to be 529 million human beings by nature, who can be fed and sustained in abundance in a natural way. Although this number of human beings should not be set higher than 1.5 to 2.5 billion, as ancient calculations by the universal prophet Nocodemian prove for a planet like Earth. Earth humans do not pay any attention to these calculations, however, because in their irresponsibility they also do not care that the ecological carrying capacity of the planetary habitat in relation to the human masses, which today in 2018 already amounts to over 8.9 billion, has long since been exceeded. Already in 2022, in relation to the size and fertility of planet Earth, any naturally reasonable number of 529 million to at most 2.5 billion human beings will be massively exceeded by more than 9 billion, which will then not only mean overcrowding of the planet and enormous damage to the entire earthly ecology, but its complete overload. From an ecological point of view, this can absolutely no longer be seen as a trivial matter, because from this point of view, with regard to the totality of the interrelationships between the overpopulated Earth humans and their environment, the entire household of nature and thus also of all other living beings is disturbed and completely out of joint. And this is happening in such a way that the ever-worsening course of ecological destruction is becoming more and more blatant, because there is no insight on the part of the Earthlings, and therefore no way of counteracting the evil. Obstruction or prevention would have to begin by enlightening and instructing earthly mankind, by bringing them to realization, to understanding, to reason and thus also to an understanding of the effective state of affairs with regard to the danger and threat to the existence of mankind, the planet, and all life through overpopulation. And this would have to be done through enlightenment, by teaching all Earth humans to understand and also to comprehend and to be willing to drastically curb the overpopulation growth through a birth stop of several years, and also to completely stop any generation of offspring for certain years. This would also mean that it would have to be taught and understood that thereafter offspring would only be produced in accordance with a sensible, state-designed and intentional birth control, which would have to be brought to a normal, Earth-tolerable level in order to preserve humanity, nature, its fauna and flora, and the planet. This would be a correct way to reduce the mass of Earth human overpopulation thoroughly, effectively, efficiently, emphatically, massively, severely, strictly, rigorously, decisively, harshly, sharply, relentlessly, gravely and energetically to a low number suitable for both the recovery of the Earth resource-exploited planet, its largely destroyed nature and fauna and flora, the waters, the climate, the atmosphere, and for the entire environment in terms of forests, meadows, fields, and floodplains, good and positive and thus also regenerative, even if regeneration must ultimately be expected to take tens of thousands of years. The effects of climate change, undoubtedly caused by earthly mankind, are already leading to much more frequent and catastrophic extreme weather, droughts and floods, respectively, to effective natural disasters. For various regions in different countries, it is precarious for the already existing populations. But especially for the irresponsibly growing population, it is to be feared that the supply of food, water, and many necessary necessities will no longer be sufficient. But this means, and this is proving to be the case more and more often, that also for this reason new conflicts will break out and murder, manslaughter, and persecution will become more and more frequent and in the future uncontrollably rampant. And this is happening and will continue to happen far into the future. Among many other reasons, such as religious hatred and persecution, which will constantly create new conflicts and make the flow of refugees ever greater and more unstoppable. An example in this regard is the refugee flows of the Islamic Rohingya, hundreds of thousands of whom fled their homeland as of August 2017, fleeing the violence, persecution, and murder of the oh-so-peaceful Buddhist population of Burma. The Burmese believers in Islam, the Rohingya, have been persecuted in Burma since ancient times, so they have had to flee en masse, finding refuge in neighboring Bangladesh, which is one of the poorest and most densely populated countries in the world. However, the conditions in the provisional reception camps are extremely precarious, which leads to a new tragedy due to the monsoon season, or rainy season. A huge wave of refugees, unprecedented. Around 1 million members of the Burmese Rohingya crossed the border to Bangladesh within a few weeks from August 2017. All of them fled in panic from the unprecedented violence of the peaceful and philanthropic Buddhists. In fact, it was mainly the Burmese security forces who attacked, murdered, raped, and destroyed the home villages of the Islamic Rohingya. Every day, distraught and exhausted human beings fled empty-handed, creating the world's largest refugee camp in Bangladesh virtually overnight. Around 1 million Rohingya have since sought refuge in makeshift camps in the hinterland of the coastal city of Cox's Bazar in autumn 2017. Of all these people driven from their homes as a result of their religion and their religious belief in Islam, about 80% are women and children. The situations in the huge, confusing refugee camps are extremely precarious and are becoming increasingly so, because not only are hardship and misery spreading, but there is also the threat of disease and epidemics. The camps are completely overcrowded, and, as a result, the infrastructures are also tremendously overloaded. And if one thinks of the future of this stateless Islam-believing minority, what is to become of them and of their refugee status, then everything is absolutely uncertain. Now, a new tragedy is looming due to the monsoon season, which usually peaks in August. Consequently, the rains that have already started have caused slopes to slide, while violent monsoon storms damaged and in some cases completely destroyed the makeshift tents and huts made of bamboo canes and plastic sheets. Thousands of refugees had to be brought to safety. With regard to the greenhouse gases already mentioned, it should also be said that the global community, which is not really a global community, but only a disunited, unpeaceful, contradictory and hostile and loose disunity of states, agreed at the 2015 Climate Summit in Paris to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This was to prevent the global temperature from rising by more than 2 degrees above the level at the beginning of industrialization. Industrialization is defined as the development from the production of goods by manual labor to the production of goods by machines in factories. The basic country of origin of industrialization was England, because that is where the Industrial Revolution began around 1780, with emissions actually stagnating, in particular as a result of decreased emissions in the USA and China, after which, however, worldwide emissions have risen again since 2013 and 2016 and are continuing to rise. This will remain the case, however, because the emission reductions promised by the states since Paris are becoming smoke and mirrors or an illusion as a result of the endlessly growing overpopulation and the emissions that will inevitably continue to destroy the atmosphere. And this will be so because as a result of the growing Earth humans and their increasing needs, these can only be created with ever greater harmful emissions. So no better emission targets can be achieved, which is why a temperature increase of 4 or even 5 degrees is possible, because the inexorably growing earthly humanity inevitably has ever-increasing higher demands and needs, which inevitably means that ever-increasing amounts of energy will continue to be needed, which will increase in the foreseeable future in such a way that they can only be produced in part with alternative technologies in the future, unless research leads to the invention of a total solution for energy production. Well, the fact is that emissions will again increase drastically in the coming decades, and thus will not decrease, because it has long been demonstrable that the carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere continues to grow faster and faster. Even if humanity were to succeed in exploiting the planet's resources in such a sustainable way, and inventing and creating new things that 11 or more billion Earthlings could be supplied with them, the question would still arise as to how and in what way all the billions of descendants would have to exist on an Earth with destroyed nature, fauna, flora, and a broken climate, because then it would no longer be possible to speak of life. If overpopulation continues to be driven up irresponsibly, then the Earth humans' violent catastrophe is indeed unstoppable. And the fact that this mega catastrophe is actually imminent in the future is also contributed to by greed, hatred, faith, luxury, wealth, poverty and injustice, as well as terrorism, false laws, lack of relationships among human beings, indifference, violence, coercion, lack of social welfare, discord, as well as drugs, alcohol, addiction to pleasure, diseases, epidemics and vices, etc. This is because in all these relationships the behavior of the human beings of the Earth, as well as their reactions in relation to present and future development, are degenerating more and abnormally. If we take a closer look, this is particularly evident in the industrial nations, for in these the whole moral degeneration, the decline of understanding, reason, and intelligence of the human beings is particularly evident as a result of the wrong development in practically all conceivable human behavior. Because of this, and precisely because it could only result from the enormous number of human beings of overpopulation, the greatest environmental and weather catastrophes, etc., have been caused in the past 9 decades, and irreparable climate change and climate damage has been caused, which is effectively climate destruction. The relatively huge overpopulation of earthly human beings creates a much greater ecological damage and destruction imprints per capita from the human beings in the industrialized countries than from the human beings in the developing and emerging countries. If all the human beings in the so-called third world countries also lived in the same way as those in the industrialized countries, then the Earth would already be on the brink of collapse or all-destroying collapse. The fact is that if, for example, the total energy consumption of a human being from childhood to adulthood is considered in the industrialized countries, this human being consumes 36 to 38 times more energy than a child in the developing and newly industrialized countries up to adulthood. It is also a fact that the human beings in these countries, in Africa, Asia, India and Latin America, as well as in Arabia and China, would like to have a comparable level of prosperity to that which prevails in the industrialized countries, although this development will certainly be a long time coming in the countries mentioned. This causes many human beings in these countries to flee their homelands, as a result of which they leave their countries like swarms of locusts and rush in great streams of refugees to the industrialized countries, especially to Europe, which is regarded in the third world countries as a paradise, so to speak, where wine and honey are supposed to flow. As a result of the flight of people from the refugee countries, the consumption of energy and resources in these countries should actually decrease significantly. However, this is not the case, because on the contrary, it continues to increase because companies and corporations of the industrialized countries and the refugee countries or developing and emerging countries are irresponsibly exploiting more and more resources and exploiting the earth, clearing forests and exploiting and robbing the still fertile lands through food plant plantations with monocultures. But also where the streams of refugees from third world countries etc. strand in the industrialized countries, energy consumption increases more and more in relation to the number of refugees who enter legally or illegally and inevitably become energy users in every vital respect. So there is no decrease in any state on Earth in terms of energy consumption, just as there is no decrease in CO2 emissions. And this despite the fact that the energy efficiency of all kinds of apparatus, working machines, automobiles, appliances, vehicles, and aeroplanes, etc., has developed strongly and ever higher. And the fact that more and more energy is needed and consumed is also due to the fact that more and more convenient inventions of the above-mentioned forms are being developed, manufactured, marketed, and used, which does not result in any energy savings but, on the contrary, in ever greater energy consumption, even when, for example, apparatus, working machines, vehicles, ships and airplanes, etc. consume significantly less fuel than before and also pollute the atmosphere and breathing air for the human beings of the Earth and all living beings in general with fewer CO2 emissions. In principle, the first priority is to rigorously stop and prevent human population growth in order to then keep the Earth's population at a healthy and planetary level with a low reproduction rate. It is also necessary to significantly curb and drastically limit the depletion of resources and the consumption of energy and resources, and to distribute the resources that can still be used more fairly and sensibly. Equally, however, it is also necessary to save energy, as well as for all human beings on Earth to limit themselves with regard to all necessary relationships concerning the preservation of humanity and life of Earth humans, nature and its fauna and flora, etc., both in the wealthy industrialized countries and in the developing and newly industrialized countries, right down to the human beings in the poorest regions of the Earth. Only in this way is it possible that a change for the better and the good, and a benefit for the Earth's population as well as for nature, fauna, flora, and the climate can occur and have a long-term effect on the entire planet. It would be enormously important and helpful for all life, earthly humanity, nature, its fauna and flora, if human society would completely stop the growth of the Earth's population for 7 years and prevent 1 billion descendants and thus ideally reduce the population of the existing humanity rapidly also in a natural way, and also through the natural many millions of deaths. The idiocy of those stupid researchers and scientists is unbelievable who advocate incentives for more births and thus offspring, as they propagate this especially for some countries as a result of their shrinking populations. For Western women, a bonus is proposed that is not geared towards having only one child, or no child at all. This is supposed to stimulate a new way of thinking, and that the rich world, or the women of the rich, industrialized countries should take it as an example and model to give birth to just as many children in the rich world, as is the case in the developing and emerging countries, where contraception is often nothing more than a useless shot in the hot oven. And this, according to the bullshit of renowned researchers and scientists who obviously lack not only effective knowledge but also intellect. Reason and intelligence is supposed to be an important signal in the direction of a healthy world population, as is practiced in certain third world developing and emerging countries. As a rule, despite the overflowing overpopulation, Moronic and irresponsible economic reasons are often cited for the fact that more children should be born in the industrialized countries, because otherwise society would age and the necessary labor force would be lacking. This is how the naive researchers, scientists, economists, sociologists, and other experts see the overall situation with regard to the creation of offspring. So they spin, oracle, whisper, threaten, and condemn every birth stop and every birth regulation in their moronic doomsaying and fantasize the downfall of the entire economy, as well as that of prosperity and old age pensions. In addition, they claim that the lack of new births also endangers the world of work because there are not enough workers to do all the necessary work. In contrast to this, however, is the effective fact that there are more than enough human beings in the world, also today, who would gladly fill all the gaps that arise on the labor market. If only they were given the chance to do so, and were not demanded to meet impossible idiotic requirements as work prerequisites that they cannot fulfill. Today, the integration of an Earth human being seeking work, woman or man, is a lottery in terms of getting a job as a result of the delusions of grandeur of the employers, in terms of the delusions of work training demanded of job seekers. Today, the whole thing is a wild and confused challenge for a job-seeking human being, which many job seekers cannot cope with because, on the one hand, many are already considered too old and rejects in their middle years of 40 to 45 years. But on the other hand, they cannot fulfill the idiotic requirements in terms of professional or work experience. As a matter of principle, it must also necessarily be said that offspring should in any case, in no case, and never be conceived and born to secure labor and old age pensions, and not even in such a way that they would have to maintain their own parents in old age, as was erroneously and confusedly the case in earlier times when masses of children were conceived and brought into the world for this purpose alone. Also to beget and give birth to offspring because it is simply nicer for society when children populate the world is just as inhumane, pathologically degenerated, stupid, and primitive. Offspring or children, when they are born, have to live, act, do, and work for their own sake, which is why it is absolutely irrelevant and does not matter what race, skin color, family, class, and descent they are. What is important is only what path they take in their lives, that they are righteous, cultivate a good and positive disposition, and how they will walk in the world of today and tomorrow with dignity and honor. And the only thing that must be important to them when they grow up is whether they want to be free or whether they want to commit themselves and whether they follow their natural urge to procreate or not against the background of global development. Consequently, they also think for themselves whether 1 or 2 children are enough for them.
A good and valuable monologue that calls the effective facts by their names.
This is also in line with my opinion, but I think you should now explain your accidental event before we continue our conversation.
Okay, the whole thing happened on the 1st of June, down in Tablat, but there is a short backstory to it, which starts with the fact that for years, an elderly man has been going from Goswell to Wheela and back again several times a week with 2 small ponies. He always leads the small pony on his left side and the bigger one on his right. As this always delights me when Eva and I pass by on our way to go shopping, I decided to donate something to the man's feed for the ponies, always remembering to approach him from the left side, just to the left of his little ponies, because I had already learned from Svath and also in farming to always approach animals of all kinds from the left side. On the 1st of June, the opportunity for my plan arose when Eva stopped the car about 30 meters from the man with the ponies, and I got out, which I realized, but then had a blackout. When I was able to think clearly again, I was lying in the meadow about 3 meters from the road and had tremendous pain in my right shoulder and upper arm. As it turned out, contrary to my knowledge, will and my usual behavior of always approaching living beings on the left, I had approached the man with the 2 ponies head-on, who had tied the 2 animals together and was holding them by his hands on the left and right. The result was that the ponies broke free from the man's hands and ran into the meadow, of course dragging me along with them and throwing me away because they were tied together. The pain was really intense, which is why Eva drove me to the Winterthur Cantonal Hospital without hesitation. where I was told during the first examination that the arm was dislocated and would therefore have to be put back in place. So I knew what to expect, because I had already undergone such a procedure once before at the age of 20, when I also dislocated my right arm as a result of a fall down a flight of stairs. Then, however, an X-ray was taken of my shoulder and upper arm in Winterthur Hospital, which showed that not only was the arm dislocated, but the armpit ball was shattered, and the upper arm bone was also broken underneath it, whereupon I was given a cuff to stabilize the upper arm and the dislocated armpit joint. I was then advised by the head doctor to have an operation to fit a new upper arm joint or ball and socket made of titanium. That is to say, a shoulder joint or ball and socket joint on the shoulder blade and a ball and socket joint on the upper arm. Naturally, the articular cartilage covers both the glenoid cavity and the ball, and thus enables the joint surfaces to glide optimally. Later, when it came to explaining the procedure to me, the assistant surgeon explained the exact circumstances and also the risks of the operation, explaining that there was a 30% certainty that everything would go well. And according to his explanation, the risk was really great because, on the one hand, I would not have had to lie down for this operation, but would have had to be operated on in a semi-sitting position. And consequently, the transport of blood from the heart to the brain would have been much more difficult than if I had just been able to lie down. So the assistant surgeon clearly said that with the 30% certainty of success, on the one hand as a result of the circumstances of the operation, and on the other hand with regard to my aortic heart valve operation in 2015, I would really have a great risk of not surviving the operation. If not enough blood is pumped into the brain, 30 to 60 seconds would be enough for an exodus to occur. He also gave me some of this in writing, in relation to the further risks if the operation were successful. It says here in this protocol that 1. There would be a risk of coma, and 2. Of cardiovascular collapse, which would probably have meant that I could have taken the black box and the screws for it right away, and then screwed it shut. An arm amputation was listed as the third risk, while something was explained in the fourth place that I have forgotten and which I also cannot decipher here on this information protocol. But I can read out briefly what was written here in this protocol.
Diagnosis: displaced fracture of the left humerus in several parts with poor bone quality and probably circulatory disturbances of the head fragment, pre-damaged rotational cuff. The fact that this prognosis refers to the left, that is to say the left arm, whereas in reality it is the right arm, can be overlooked. And what is described as a fracture of the humerus on the left in several parts means that the joint ball is effectively shattered, and the humerus directly under it is fractured throughout. Without surgery, dysfunction, chronic pain, malposition, circulatory disturbance of the individual fragments, head necrosis. This is the prognosis if surgery is not performed. I searched the internet to find out what is meant by head necrosis and found the following, and now I know that there is also hip head necrosis. But in my case it is meant as humeral head necrosis. Humeral head necrosis or humeral head necrosis is the death of the bone of the humeral head, often for unknown reasons and to varying degrees. As a result, the bone of the humeral head becomes soft and less load-bearing in the loading zone. This causes the surface and the cartilage on the surface of the humeral head to deform to varying degrees. This is how the joint breaks down. The pain in the upper arm slowly increases over weeks and months. It is felt in the shoulder or the upper arm and also torments sufferers at night. Over time, the pain-causing posture can lead to restricted shoulder movement and even stiffness of the shoulder. A cracking and/or rubbing sensation may occasionally occur. In most cases, however, the disease is already more advanced. If left untreated, humeral head necrosis or humeral head necrosis leads to destruction and deformation of the humeral head. Due to the circulatory disturbance, the bone softens and is no longer strong enough to bear weight. The bone deforms and the humeral head becomes rounded. This eventually leads to wear and tear in the shoulder-head joint, with corresponding rubbing, pain, inability to use and restricted movement. If left untreated, humeral head necrosis causes the bone to soften more and more as a result of the disturbed blood circulation in the humeral head. This means that it becomes less load-bearing and its surface sags. It deforms. Consequently, the shoulder joint no longer runs smoothly, and there is abrasion of the cartilage bone in the shoulder. As a result, the pain in the shoulder usually worsens over time, and with increasing humeral head necrosis. X-ray or CT core MRI can show the increasing de-rounding of the humeral head and narrowing of the glenohumeral joint space. Subsequently, the shoulder joint becomes increasingly stiff, and the destruction and pain in the shoulder so obvious that an artificial shoulder joint shoulder prosthesis becomes necessary. This is therefore the prognosis according to this information protocol for the case without surgery and without the insertion of an artificial joint ball and a new joint socket made of titanium. Although the following is stated here with regard to surgery. With surgery, various procedures, possible reconstruction, anatomical partial prosthesis, inverse prosthesis. The aim is to achieve the best possible function and freedom from pain with preservation of independence. Treatment alternatives: no surgery, chronic pain and shoulder stiffness likely. Partial prosthesis? Poorer function is to be expected. Reconstruction, not recommended due to the fracture pattern, restricted blood supply, avital bone parts. Surgery, entering the humeral head, opening the rotational interval and setting down the long biceps tendon, removal of the head fragments. The bony attachments of the musculature are sutured on adjusting the glenoid and preparing for the glenoid. Component, attachment of these components with screws, cementless, in the correct orientation, preparing the upper arm shaft medullary cavity, cementing in the shaft component, reduction of the prosthesis and reflexation of the prepared tubercle, relining with own bone, possibly fixation of the long biceps tendon, possibly read-on drainage, wound closure in layers, dry dressing and abduction pad, possible general complications. Hematoma with necessary reoperation is rare. Infection locally, usually joint involvement, follow-up surgery necessary, wound healing disorder, thrombosis and pulmonary embolism, possible operation, specific complications. Nerve damage or irritation through surgical access, in this case mainly the axillary nerve, explanation from the internet. The axillary nerve is a nerve of the brachial plexus. In human beings, it has its roots in the spinal cord between the 5th and 7th cervical segments, C5-C6, in domestic animals in C6-C8. Rarely injury to blood vessels or nerves leading into the arm, possible long-term restriction of movement in the shoulder joint, loosening of the prosthesis, prosthesis dislocation, bone fracture during surgery or later periprosthetic fracture, acromion fracture. Occasionally there is excessive bone resorption with strong inflammatory manifestations and pain complex regional pain syndrome. Special risk factors of the patient: AAM, coma, HK cardiovascular failure, amputation. Cannot be read, deciphered. Special remarks: a functional impairment of the shoulder often remains.
So that is the description of the specialist explanations for the operation regarding my accidental injury, whereby the operation was scheduled for Monday, the 19th of June 2018 at 11:30 HRS. However, when the assistant surgeon later explained the risks of the operation in relation to my case, I was struck by strange thoughts and feelings which led me to decide not to have the operation. And that's that. Because since then, I have been trying to get the arm back under control by doing all kinds of movement exercises myself. And I am also having good success with it, because as you can see, I can already move the arm well.
Your mobility with your arm amazes me very much because what you are able to do is not really possible after only 2 months after the accident. And besides, every movement should cause you a lot of pain.
You have also seen during your visits lately that I have been doing movement exercises again and again, and that there has always been a lot of pain. But I think that I can only use my arm again and make it work if I bear the pain and do not slacken in the movement exercises. So I just do not pay attention to them and just let them go crazy, even if it's hard sometimes. But the main thing is that the arm becomes able to move again, and it does not matter if the pain sometimes almost makes my brain burst.
What you read out of the recon protocol is equivalent to barbaric bungling, but not medical knowledge and skill.
You forget that I live here on Earth, and the medical knowledge of the Earthlings is still tremendously behind what is commonplace among you Plejaren.
That is so, of course, but still it is barabari and bumbling, and to that I wonder how you can get along with it.
He makes his own medicine by being mentally correct, and also doing all that is necessary according to his own ability. Of course I know that. But still it never ceases to amaze me how Edward copes with such happenings that affect him, and also copes with great pain, how it must be really very disabling in the case of the serious injury.
You should not start talking shop about this, and besides, everything you wanted to know has probably been said and explained. So let that be enough with what has been said and explained. And also with the fact that I do not need to be told how many more months the pain will last, and that I must diligently continue to do range of motion exercises to get the arm back in order.
Of course. But how you can move and use your arm again just 2 months after the accident without specialist medical intervention and help is still more than extremely amazing to me.
It is always the case that you have to do something yourself and enough if you want to climb a green branch. So I also want to see to it and do everything possible to make my arm fully functional again. Even when the pain is going crazy, which is especially the case with movement exercises and certain work activities, as well as when I am working on the computer. I only hope that I will really succeed and that the nasty risk diagnoses will not come to the fore, as they have been painted as the consequences of not having the operation.
English translation, 709th Contact, Part 3. Sunday the 29th of July 2018, 1:41 hours.
But now enough should really have been said about this, because there are more important things to discuss, such as something concerning the death rune peace symbol, the so-called CND symbol, whereby a few things should be explained about this, because this alleged peace symbol causes tremendous harm and mischief, and the Earthlings do not understand that this false symbol is the origin of discord, war, hatred, death and ruin, etc. This is in complete contrast to the real peace symbol, as Nokodemion designed and created millions of years ago, and also brought it into the spiritual teachings as a spiritual teaching symbol.
To talk about this some other time and to clarify various points, I think that is necessary.
I think so too, for when I consider all the negative and malicious happenings and behavior of Earth humans, which are degenerating more and more frequently and steadily, then it is inevitable to take up the subject again, in order to show the danger of the nonsensical false symbol with the death rune, which in no way brings peace, but on the contrary, by means of extremely negative swinging waves, causes only malicious mischief, as well as discord, hatred, rebellion, war, discontent, and destruction and ruin.
The death rune, as well as others, has its origin in the Germanic culture, like Odin, that is to say Wotan, and Thor, that is to say Donar. For centuries, the mysterious inscriptions have inspired the imagination of so-called scientists and laymen, as they also do in modern myths. Nowadays, especially in Europe, but also all over the world, runes are associated with Nazis and neo-Nazis, and partly rightly so, because in the Third Reich, dictator Adolf Hitler ran a cult around the runes. But the fact is that even today, more than 70 years after the Third World War of 1939 to 1945, the rune of death and other runes are used as a sign of recognition by many mad imitators of the former Nazis, who stupidly out themselves as young Nazis. The harmful and disastrous false peace sign, which falsely and peace-destroyingly represents an upside-down tree of life, is extremely popular in the left-wing scene and among peace activists. However, these ignorant, uneducated people who are misled with regard to the false peace symbol are not aware, and to this day are not aware that they are promoting harm, discord, war, murder, and manslaughter with this false symbol. The false peace symbol, which is effectively a death sign, became popular through the hippies, who made it a trademark for themselves. The rune symbol is effectively a rune that does not mean peace, but death and destruction. Almost nobody knows that the peace sign, which is used worldwide, is actually a rune and the symbol of death. As a peace sign, the rune should stylize life, so the symbol should represent a tree growing upwards, which effectively symbolizes life or the beginning of life. The inverted tree of life, however, as depicted in the false peace symbol, stands for death and the end of life. As a symbol of the peace movement, the death rune first appeared in London in 1958, at the very first Easter March, whereby this false peace symbol was chosen in stupidity for the campaign for nuclear disarmament, because it was intended to show that nuclear weapons mean death, and the death of millions of human beings. Effectively, this Celtic symbol of death used to also be a symbol of a satanic blessing during rituals. This symbol was also used by Yasser Arafat, Richard Nixon, Winston Churchill, and Stuart Meacham, company chairman of the New Reds Mobilization Committee, with the British Prime Minister Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill declaring that the symbol could be used for victory. It should be borne in mind that Winston Churchill was one of the initiated elite and a Freemason, personally a sedentary and school hater. As a politician, a vicious warmonger and crook, who was nevertheless awarded a Nobel Prize, as has happened in respect of other undeserving and unworthy Nobel Prize recipients. He was a man who most likely knew the extremely bad meaning of this symbol, and also thought and acted in this bad way, although he tried to embellish himself and his behavior. A fact such as that he was actually the one who did everything possible in the last World War, which Hitler had started, to pilot the USA with its army into Europe and to interfere in the war worldwide as a whole, should already be enough to reveal Churchill's evil mind. As I know from Svath's stories, and I can still half remember what he explained to me about various events relating to the first years of the beginning of the World War, which I only know from his explanations, as well as the fact that Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill came from the British aristocracy and was the one who made London into a heavily fortified city and built it up in the center with concrete machine gun nests, so that it was no longer an open city. The reason for this was because Hitler's Air Force began to attack military installations near the city. But Hitler's order contained the strict instruction not to attack the city as such, as Svath explained to me at the time. So then the Nazi bombers, it was, if I remember Svath's explanation correctly, on the night of 23 to the 24th of August, 1940, German night bombers attacked the oil tanks near a town. However, they were attacked and driven off by a squadron of British Hurricanes fighters or interceptors, with the Nazi bombers dropping their bombs on dock installations in East London as a result of a navigational error. The dock facilities were considered military installations. But Hitler did not accept the misbombing and had the bomber crews court-martialed, from which they were demoted and transferred to the infantry. For Churchill, this bombing raid was exactly what he had been waiting for, as it gave him the reason to carry out his warmongering against Nazi Germany and the USA, especially also to persuade the then U.S. President Roosevelt to mobilize the U.S. forces to come to Europe and intervene and massively contribute to the war effort. In retaliation, Churchill issued an order to carry out a whole series of bombings on Berlin, and thus on the civilian population. On the one hand officially as revenge, but on the other hand to provoke Hitler and induce him to also bomb the civilian population and the capital of England. So the first bombing of Berlin took place on the night of 25 to the 26th of August, using over 80 bombers. Around 30 crews then claimed that their bombs had hit Berlin, while around 30 others could not find the city. Of the remaining bomber crews, some had to return to England without having achieved anything, and of course, simply dropped their bomb loads somewhere indiscriminately because they could not have landed with them. According to Schwath's statements, if I remember correctly, 5 bomber planes were shot down by Nazi anti-aircraft fire. Churchill, however, ordered further such bombing raids, which did take place, but did not fare any better than the first raid, which probably cost human lives, but otherwise hardly caused any significant damage in Berlin. As a result of these bombing raids ordered by Churchill, the losses of crews and aircraft increased continuously, which left him in need of explanation and looking for a way out, whereby this consisted, which he had already deviously planned in the hope with regard to his provocation, with the bombing of Berlin, in the fact that the USA would now consider entering the war against Hitler if he asked the USA for it, and put forward the danger of the bombing of London. So he went to the American ambassador, Joseph Kennedy, and asked whether the bombing of London was reason enough for the USA to intervene in the war, as US President Roosevelt had threatened to do in 1939 when he warned the belligerent states in Europe. The American ambassador, Joseph Kennedy, saw through Churchill's intrigue and accordingly gave him a dismissive reply, though he did want to know how far Churchill would go to realize his plans. In fact, he saw through Churchill's insidious warmongering in relation to the British bombing of Nazi Germany as well, as the reaction of the Nazi German attacks on London in order to be able to force US President Roosevelt and the US rulers to the point where US America would intervene in the war in Europe. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy also knew a lot more than that, which is why he also distrusted Churchill for good reason. But I cannot say anything about this because I have forgotten the effective facts, which is why I want to ask you, Ptah, whether you can still say what is necessary about this.
I can, because I have dealt with all these events in detail. Churchill was very well informed that Lord Philip Henry Kerr, 11th Marquess of Lothian, a British politician, journalist and diplomat, and at that time ambassador in Washington, had been made a very favorable peace offer by Hitler, which was completely contrary to Churchill's warmongering plans and hatred and vindictiveness against Adolf Hitler. He was very anxious to dissuade Churchill from his war plans and as a result advised him to hold back and abandon his vicious and war-promoting plans and not to engage in any negative activities which would cause the efforts for peace to fail. U.S. President Roosevelt was also involved in this matter and was willing to go along with the German dictator's concern and do what was necessary to keep peace and avoid war, in which the U.S. should cooperate in not interfering in Nazi policy and not in their war mania. So U.S. President Roosevelt was also of the opinion and concern that the peace offer should not be rejected lightly. However, this fact and all the trimmings were absolutely secret and were not to be made public. So the English House of Commons was not informed about it, nor were the English people. Nor was the world public, so it was never made public that the German people secretly wanted to make peace with the help of the Americans before the USA became active in Europe. And it was also a fact that Churchill, because he lived in his warmongering, also had confused dreams, such as one in which he was captured and tortured during a German invasion, which caused wretched fear in him, which led him to seek war allies in Spain and Sweden. But when, according to the actual situation of Hitler's warfare, he became sure that no invasion would take place, his warmongering speeches became more and more provocative, worse and even fanatical, in order to convince the English House of Commons and the people that Hitler was a boundless enemy of England. And in this way he carried on propaganda for his warmongering, although he, like Joseph Kennedy, also knew very well that Hitler had no enmity whatsoever against England, just as it never occurred to him to attack England. However, Churchill then learned that Adolf Hitler wanted to speak on the anniversary of the Beer Hall Putsch, or rather on the failed Hitler Putsch that had taken place in Munich on the 8th of November, 1923, the aim of which, under the party leadership of the NSDAP, precisely Adolf Hitler as well as Erich Ludendorff and others involved, was to depose the government in Berlin by means of an armed putsch and to seize power himself in the form of a national dictatorship. However, this failed thoroughly because the radical right-wing forces soon distanced themselves completely from Hitler, his ideas, and his plans for a coup after they had first allied themselves with him. As a result, he failed in his attempt to win over right-wing conservative circles in the Bavarian government and administration, who then did not participate in the attempted coup. Nor did the Reichswehr, so that the coup plan failed and the march to the Feldherrnhalle was also stopped by force by the Bavarian state police, resulting in 20 deaths. Hitler was then imprisoned, but after his trial he was released on the 20th of December 1924, but in the long run the attempted putsch had consequences for him as well as for Bavaria. As for Churchill, however, who continued to incite war against Germany, he again ordered new attacks against the Hitler Empire. This time, a bombing raid on Munich as a result of the anniversary of the Beer Hall Putsch, attacking with more than 50 bombers and Nazi anti-aircraft fire shooting down 11 British aircraft. The whole thing was a failure, however, for as with the bombing of Berlin, no serious damage was done in Munich either. And Churchill's idea of killing Hitler during his speech by the bombing was only a hopeful illusion, because when the bombing took place, Adolf Hitler was not in Munich at all. This annoyed Churchill very much, which is why he soon followed up this senseless attack in Munich with another, misjudging that he could thereby consolidate his tarnished prestige. So he ordered a new bombing of Berlin, believing in his delusion that he could achieve something phenomenal by bombing Berlin at the time when the Russian Foreign Minister Molotov arrived in Berlin to hold conversations with Hitler. So Churchill ordered a massive bombing of Berlin to, as he stupidly announced, greet Molotov, ordering over 50 bombers to lay most of Berlin in ruins. But, as in the first and earlier bombings, their bombs did little damage, and about 20 bombers were shot down by Nazi anti-aircraft fire. Moreover, it was also the case this time that most of the crews of the bombers were unable to find their assigned targets. Unfortunately, however, a school and a hospital were hit, and this was then the trigger for Hitler to start raging against England and trigger the series of retaliatory actions. Now, however, as regards the nonsensical symbol of peace, which is falsely represented by the rune of death, we have spoken of this before, and have found that by this symbol is not promoted peace but strife, mischief, misfortune, terror, war, insurrection, death, and ruin. And this has been proved over and over again since the symbol came into being, and will continue to be proved, for this symbol of death, which Earth humans senselessly do not understand, is regarded as a false symbol of peace and is therefore misused, because those who use it are not aware of the negative and even dangerous vibrational effect of this symbol. They erroneously and confusingly hope for a positive effect, which, however, in truth never comes about, but is in any case always negative and malignant, and will consequently remain so. The death rune, which is nonsensically, erroneously and thoughtlessly used and worshipped by countless uninitiated, but also esoterically believing Earth humans as an alleged symbol of peace, is also used as a logo of the opponents of war and nuclear power, as it was also highly used by the hippie movement, which corresponded to a counterculture that had emerged in the United States in the mid-1960s and which radically challenged the values of patriarchal and capitalist bourgeois society, both in the realm of art and in individual social and political life. Even today, the death rune symbol is still popular as a false peace symbol, as well as a symbol in the music and fashion industry, although this symbol also causes great unrest there, especially since the mid-1980s. because since then the music, which until then had been mostly harmonious in many directions, has become completely disharmonious and even completely unmelodic, discordant, impure, dissonant, unclean, and thus completely cacophonous up to the present day. And this is the case, as you once said with regard to the shouting, howling, and screeching of the so-called singers, as well as with regard to the instrumental clatter, droning noise, and deafening spectacle, if I may use your terminology once again. It really is not a symbol of peace. The origin of the absurd, false, and irrational death rune peace symbol is based on the two letters N and D from the Winker alphabet. This symbol nonsense was designed in 1958 by the British artist Gerald Holtham for nuclear war opponents and their first big peace march in London. In this regard, he was acting on behalf of the British Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament CND for the purpose of the world's first Easter March in London towards the Nuclear Weapons Research Center at Aldermaston. What Holtham created, however, was a very peace-negative symbol, which is still used today and causes much harm throughout the world through its use and the negative swinging waves it causes in the consciousness of Earth humans. Holtham's explanation of his foolish and illogical symbol design was that the symbol consisted of the two letters N and D of the Winker alphabet and stood for nuclear disarmament. The fact that the artist used a sign language from war for his false death rune peace symbol was not only strange and confusing, because the death rune or death symbol had been in frequent use just a few years before and stood for death and destruction. Also in the Third Reich or Nazi Empire, the old Germanic year rune, which was turned upside down, became one of their main symbols. Because the SS or Schutzstaffel used this symbol for death, consequently the death rune was also used for death notices, for the date of death and as an inscription on gravestones. This instead of the usual genealogical sign, that is to say, a religious cross. But the actual origin of the symbol was even earlier, namely in the modern era of emerging Christianity, namely in the 1st century as a symbol of the persecution of Christians in Rome. At that time, Emperor Nero persecuted the Christians in Rome and had them brutally executed. The Apostle Peter is also said to have been crucified upside down, as forged apostolic writings are supposed to prove. This lie, however, served to sanctify Peter and to stamp the supposedly inverted Christ cross as a symbol of blasphemy and persecution of Christians for the ruler of the time. In Christian circles, the allegedly inverted or upside-down cross was then called the Nero cross. In truth, the cross was also not one in the sense of a Christ cross, but a natural, thick tree branch with a ypsilon-shaped branch fork, as many Roman crucifixion crosses were. Peter was also crucified on such a tree branch ypsilon, erected vertically like every tree branch ypsilon or hand-carved cross on which earth humans were crucified. And the sign for Paul's crucifixion was shaped like the Germanic death rune. Consequently, it looked no different from today's insane and false death rune peace symbol. There is nothing more to explain about this.
Thanks for your explanations. The death rune as a false peace symbol is also called crow's foot, druid's foot, or witch's foot in esotericism, but in reality it still stands today, as it has since time immemorial, for death, disaster, ruin, war, and disharmony. A French esotericist, Dr. Gerard Encausse, or something like that is his name, refers to the death rune in the Science of Occultism, Traité de Science Occulte, as the most popular symbol of all centuries among occultists. But what I find amazing is the fact that such an ambiguous false symbol of peace has been able to prevail throughout the world and cause so much disaster so far because Earthlings are so stupid that they cannot recognize the evil and understand what comes out of this symbol of disaster.
Unfortunately, this is indeed the case, as you say, because the majority of Earth humans drift through life in a pathological stubbornness, whereby this stubbornness is so characterized by stubbornness and obstinacy that the Earth humans can no longer depart from their religious fanaticism or from their faith, nor from their once formed wrong opinion. Their stubbornness is also based on a resistance to advice, which prevents good advice from being given, from which it also results that stubbornness in the negative sense forms itself into a hardly more resolvable narrow-mindedness. Stubbornness, dominance, doggedness, and crampedness, as well as into fanaticism and harshness, and finally, under certain circumstances, leads to loneliness and isolation.
But stubbornness also exists in a positive sense, namely in the form of profound endurance or perseverance, which can also be defined and understood in a good and positive sense as obstinacy, intransigence, doggedness, and tenacity. In this way, obduracy can be interpreted and understood in a positive and acceptable way, as being valid in terms of strength, constancy, honesty, firmness, peacefulness, straightforwardness, kindness, persistence, helpfulness, learning, love, tenacity, and purposefulness. In relation to goodness of mind, there are also all the values of altruistic forms, such as obligingness, nobleness and kindness, being charitable, good-heartedness, good-naturedness, cordiality, kindness and charity, as well as compassion, forbearance, gentleness, selflessness and disinterestedness, unselfishness, warm-heartedness, benevolence and beneficence, and ultimately also mercy. I learned from Schwath that the origin of the term stubbornness comes from drilling a hole in something, whereby the term stubbornness and being stubborn were used for human beings as early as the 10th century. So stubbornness can also mean, in a positive sense, that a human being can really stick resolutely to an opinion or cause and defend it.
Which is also correct, of course.
It is also correct that Wendell Stevens was maliciously and innocently imprisoned for allegedly sexually assaulting children, which was a lie, but he has not been rehabilitated to this day. You Playaran, that is, you, Ptah, together with your daughter Simyase and Quetzal, investigated everything extremely meticulously with regard to the accusations against Wendell concerning the alleged sexual abuse of minors. You investigated and clarified everything in such detail that it was almost exaggerated, but you could not find any wrongdoing on Wendell's part with regard to the accusations made against him. But you were not the only ones to investigate the truth in this regard, because the Earthlings also looked into the accusations against Wendell and found that they could not be true, as is also evident from many letters still on the internet today, such as these two notes. P.S. I have been watching Wendell C. Stevens for many years. Colonel Wendell Stevens was put into jail in about 1984 sometime in Tucson for sharing too much information on UFOs. The court charge was child molestation? But many people online say he never did anything like that. Just those that didn't want him to talk about his UFO sightings wanted him to stop talking? I think he spent 5 or 6 years in jail. I keep an open mind to everything. But if Mr. Stevens was jailed incorrectly, then that would be a darn shame. I know national security is important. But why do they sometimes use child sex to ridicule or slander people? Recently, however, things have been stirred up again against Wendell and me by malicious enemies, with Wendell also being accused, convicted, and imprisoned, especially with regard to the lying accusations at the time. Even in good or halfway good accounts of his person and work, things are being said that point to criticism against him, albeit in a different way, such as especially concerning UFOs and especially my person, etc., as can be seen from the following internet article.
UFO researcher LT. Colonel Wendell C. Stevens deceased. Copyright, source, UFO Photo Archives. Org.
Tucson, USA, the former LT. Colonel of the U.S. Air Force, Wendell C. Stevens, is regarded by many as a pioneer and by his critics as one of the most controversial representatives of UFO research. At the age of 87, Stevens passed away yesterday as a result of respiratory arrest. Without a doubt, Stevens was one of the world's best-known and longest-serving UFO researchers. He was born in 1923 in Round Prairie in the U.S. state of Minnesota and joined the U.S. Army in 1941. In addition, Stevens later served as an air attaché for the U.S. Air Force in South America, retired from the Army in 1963, and worked for the Hamilton Aircraft until 1972. During his time in the service, Stevens worked, according to his own later statements, for a highly secret military project in which unusual phenomena, including unidentified flying objects, were investigated in the Arctic region using various measuring instruments on board reconnaissance aircraft. After Stevens later failed to obtain the results and documents of this project, he began his own investigations into unidentified flying objects UFOs, which he continued for 54 years. As the first director, he subsequently headed the UFO research organization Aerial Phenomena Research Organization (APRO). Stevens came under particular criticism for his supportive assessment of the events and claims of Swiss UFO contactor Eduard Meier, whom even some of Stevens' comrades in arms consider to be a proven fraud, while others still consider at least some of the photographs and film footage presented by Meier as evidence to be authentic. Wendell C. Stevens also earned criticism, also from within his own ranks, for his assessment of a UFO crash event that allegedly occurred near Laredo, Texas, in July 1948. In his book about the UFO crash at Aztec, he stated that it was the crash of a U.S. experimental aircraft and that a body allegedly found at the site was that of a large rhesus monkey. In a 2009 interview, he explained that while he strongly believed that many UFO crashes were due to extraterrestrial spacecraft, the Laredo object was a secret project launched from the White Sands missile test site in New Mexico. Stevens also became known for his collection of UFO photos, which is one of the most extensive picture archives on the subject worldwide. As a result of his investigations, Stevens published more than 22 books, which have been translated into numerous languages. In 1987, he received an award for his ufological life's work at the First World UFO Forum in Brasilia. Himself, Stevens was co-founder and director of the International UFO Congresses.
Unfortunately, the Earth humans are so caught up in all the lies and slander in connection with the so-called UFOs, as well as with our contacts and with the false and various lying accusations against Wendell Stevens, that they consider the lies and slander to be the truth and are no longer able to recognize the effective real reality and its truth. And as far as the investigation into the false accusations against him at the time is concerned, the fact is that our extremely accurate findings have shown that the whole thing was based on slander coordinated by the state to silence him in several ways. On the one hand, the whole thing was related to his knowledge according to highly secret military clarifications and military findings concerning unidentified flying objects, which it was feared he might disclose and spread the truth, but which he never had the intention of doing in preservation of his honor and duty of confidentiality. On the other hand, he was not allowed to continue to work publicly in such a way that he could have provided incontrovertible proof of the correctness of the contacts between you and us, which he would have been able to do as a result of, which was also the reason why he arranged everything so that he and Lee and Britt Elders and the Savadov Young Films crew could carry out the work concerning the Contact film. Wendell Stevens, however, kept his promise and remained silent about it until his demise that he would, and also keeping the irrefutable evidence of our existence and our contacts with you as safe as well as the which should have been handed over to the government of the USA if our attempts to contact them had come about, but for reasons known to you, this was not the case. So Wendell Stevens kept all the important documents, which were provided with our security apparatus, but through which we carried out the destruction of all the material when we had to realize that it was becoming impossible for us to make contact with the government of the USA. However, for reasons unknown to us, some information had leaked out, which is why the U.S. intelligence agencies, the U.S. military and U.S. government followed certain leads that resulted in harassment against Wendell Stevens, and ultimately led to his being placed under false charges of sexual activity with minors and his being captured and imprisoned.
You are mentioning things that should not really be said.
That is so, yes, but I am speaking to you, and you know that you are not allowed to recall or write down what has been said.
Oh, so then I just have to leave out all that pertaining to consequently I should just make a series of dots, I suppose.
That is the meaning of my words.
Clear case. But then I would now like to bring up again something that happened earlier. Things and happenings that also various Figu Corps group members do not know or know only partially. Which is why I think I should list them once, and I can simply reproduce them from the internet, if you allow me.
There is nothing wrong with that.
I also agree with that.
Would you like me to read the whole thing to you?
Yes.
Of course you can.
Good. Then here is an article that appeared in magazine 2000 Plus, number 5, May-June 1999.
In December 1998, the U.S. television station Fox broadcast a feature entitled The World's Greatest Hoaxes, in which, with specious arguments, see our report on the tent film, both the authentic Lalian autopsy film and the contact case of the Swiss Billy Edouard Meier were presented as hoaxes. Mausen, with this prime example of the most primitive smear journalism. They did not even bother to listen to the opposing side, but it was based solely on the claims of a fanatical UFO opponent, the American Cal K. Korff. Korff had boasted in his books that he had worked for the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, one of the biggest weapons factories of the USA's Star Wars program. His research into the Meier case, however, consisted only of a 2-day visit to Switzerland, during which he interviewed the descendants of a Meier opponent and religious fanatic, who saw Meier as a sorcerer and devil, and Meier's ex-wife. But not a single one of Meier's more than 40 eyewitnesses or one of the objective UFO researchers who investigated the case. This is precisely what was done in Laughlin. Themed reopening the Billy Meier case, the background to this spectacular and highly interesting contact case was scrutinized. It began with Lt. Colonel W. C. Stevens, a retired U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel who initiated the first international investigation in 1978 and spent many weeks in Switzerland meticulously checking every claim Meier made. In the process, Stevens recounted how he and his 4-person team of investigators, with whom private detectives Britt and Lee Elders and Tom Welsh had traveled to Switzerland, were repeatedly asked for information, observed and accompanied by intelligence officers. He was followed by Michael Heisman, who had interviewed dozens of Meier eyewitnesses for magazine 2000 Plus and now presented these interviews, recorded on video, live to the audience. Heisman emphasized that the Meier case consists of 4 phases: Meier's childhood contacts with the Pleurencefath 1942 to R53, his contacts with Arsket, allegedly from the DAL universe, from 1953 to 64, at a time when Billier traveled the Middle East and came as far as India. That Semjay's contacts 1975 to 84, and the Shatar contacts 1984 to the present, each named after the Swiss's most important extraterrestrial contact during this phase. the Meier case under the lens on the topic's antagonist's author, Heisman M. Beamships in India, however, only the third phase that SEMJ's contacts has been investigated by Wendell Stevens and his team so far. Although, as Heisman assured, there are other important eyewitnesses and evidence for the second and fourth phases. Heisman presented Billy's son Methuselah Meier, 25, as a witness for the fourth phase, who refuted his mother's claims in a disarmingly calm, matter-of-fact manner and told of his own experiences with his father. The highlight of the second phase was Billy's stay at the Ashoka Buddhist mission in Mehrauli, near New Delhi, India, where he studied the Buddha's teachings with the now 111-year-old monk Dharmavara, who now lives near Sacramento, CA, and runs a monastery, and worked as a veterinarian on the side. Heisman succeeded in locating 2 witnesses from this phase, and he presented them to the public for the first time in Laughlin. The main witness was Phobal Cheng, the granddaughter of Dharmavara, who like him was from Cambodia. Dharmavara is a highly respected man in his country. Before he renounced all earthly things and donned the robes of a monk, he was the country's chief magistrate and a close confidant of the king. Phobal's father was a high-ranking diplomat and was on a diplomatic mission in India in the 1960s, while she and her brother grew up in their grandfather's monastery. There, a young Swiss man caught their eye. Not only because he had 2 monkeys as constant companions, he named them Emperor and Empress Hanuman, after the mythical monkey king of the myth Ramayana, but also because of his piercing eyes. Phobal Cheng he is friends with a goddess, the gardener told us, and soon Phobal also saw him, often wandering for hours through the monastery garden with a small, slender, long-haired woman with a round face and unusually long earlobes, dressed in overalls. Dozens of witnesses saw him with the goddess from the stars, but no one dared to approach her. In India, they respect the supernatural. At the same time, the same and other witnesses saw the visitor's disc-shaped spaceship, as well as strangely maneuvering lights at night, phenomena Billy photographed at the time. Sashi Raj, the second witness, Phobal's Hindi teacher Sashi Raj, confirmed the sightings. She herself witnessed the appearance of a large black disc over the ashram, and when she saw one of the Meier photos, she confirmed that it corresponded to her sighting. She had also heard about the sightings from numerous eyewitnesses. Sashi Raj, Phobal visited Billy Meier twice in Switzerland in the meantime and described the encounter with the words, "It was as if I had come home." The 2 exchanged memories throughout the night. Having been a diplomat herself at the United Nations, she was part of her country's UN delegation, and having addressed the UN General Assembly on several occasions, she hesitated for a long time before going public. Only the recent slander against Meier convinced her that it is time to stand up for the truth. Now, in cooperation with Heisman, she is trying to track down more witnesses from that time. Michael Heisman, Germany.
An interesting article that I was not aware of before.
What you read out is nothing new to me, but still good to remember.
So the reading aloud was worthwhile for you too. But now I have something that relates to your energy transmission, which I know that in your beam ships, in your giant spaceship, as well as in all your various flying apparatuses and on Era, you use in every way and for all necessities an electromagnetic resonance energy transmission that is practically limitless in its extension, and is based on a technique that in some way touches the automata realm. However, I can neither imagine nor understand anything about all this. Is it possible that you can explain something to me in this regard that would also bring progress for our earthly technology? The only thing that is clear to me is that in all your energy-using achievements you do not use any cable connections, etc., as is necessarily the case with all earthly techniques today, and is practically unavoidable. Florina and Njana recently explained to me that through your electromagnetic resonance energy transmission, which you call something completely different, and which also corresponds to something other than a simple wireless energy transmission, you can even transfer energy transmissions from Earth into your space-time structure or into your dimension over practically unlimited distances.
In order to be able to explain this technique to you in detail and to make it understandable to you, you would need, on the one hand, many years of factual training, because the whole thing is futuristic for you too, in spite of all your knowledge, which does not refer to the things of wireless energy transfer. On the other hand, your knowledge of electromagnetic technology reaches such a high level that its connections, possible uses, and far-reaching forms would still be completely incomprehensible to Earth humans. But they could learn very quickly. But if at the present time or in the near future they were capable of understanding this knowledge and using it, then a catastrophe would result, because all boundaries would be open to them in universal breadth. But this must never happen, for the prevailing attitude of the majority of Earth humans towards their sinister and completely degenerated barbarism, as well as all the resulting malicious and pejorative attitudes and behavior towards all life and every creation given existence in general, does not permit such knowledge. The rampant and far-reaching destructive, dangerous, insidious and sinister, as well as deceitful, vile and disgusting degenerations in Earth humans, which are founded in ideologically shaped false and erroneous teachings in relation to a sectarianism based on religious faith, are absolutely geared only towards destruction, ruin, and annihilation. This fact results in our not being allowed to give clear and open information nor explanations to your question, because our directives do not allow an open explanation in this respect. For an announcement would be connected with a knowledge in regard to details which must not be officially mentioned. And this because they would push Earth technical progress too far and drive Earth humans into a catastrophe which could not be stopped.
That is also what is happening with all the machinations that have been brought about by the immense mass of the ever more exuberant overpopulation, which are continuing unchecked and causing ever worse destruction and annihilation, and can no longer be stopped in the present and future times because everything has already progressed too far. I have written the following on this subject. Earth's humanity is crazy, out of its mind, and the majority of this mass is effectively acting in a degenerate and criminal manner against the planet, nature, its fauna and flora, and against life itself. In saying this, I am not condemning the majority of the human beings of the Earth themselves, but only their deeds, their actions and deeds, their lack of understanding, their inadequacy of reason and their obvious lack of intelligence, as well as their lack of peace, freedom, and justice, and their life-hostile and irresponsible thinking, acting, striving, and doing. And also when I rage against U.S. America and its irresponsible politicians, rulers, military, secret services, presidents, warmongers, and their endlessly maligned, brainless supporters from the people, etc., then I do not feel any hatred against these human beings. But I only denounce their anti-peace, anti-freedom, anti-justice, and anti-righteousness attitude and their degenerated criminal actions and deeds. I also have to mention the cowardice of those U.S. Americans who are afraid of Russia and therefore constantly agitate against it, whereby the majority of these creatures of fear are to be found in U.S. politics, among the military and those in power and their supporters from the people. All these are the ones who wage wars and torture, murder, kill and massacre countless human beings and destroy and annihilate cities and entire countries, in order to then beg the earthlings all over the world, who then falsely believe themselves to be do-gooders, although they have not done one iota to avoid the acts of war, but have even advocated them if possible. Thus, through the donations of the do-gooders in the millions and billions, the war-stricken human beings are helped in their time of need and everything destroyed is rebuilt, after which one fine day the warfare, the torturing, killing, murdering, massacring of human beings, the raping of women and the destruction of land and human achievements, as well as begging for donations from the do-gooders for the war-stricken, and the rebuilding of everything destroyed starts all over again, and this in endless succession since time immemorial. And in all this, since time immemorial, religious sectarian faith has been brought into the ugly game, through which an imaginary all-good and all-loving God is worshipped, and his alleged all-encompassing love for human beings is exalted, whereby this Almighty, however, when human beings make mistakes or allow themselves to commit an offense against his laws and recommendations, consciously or unconsciously, punishes the fallible human beings with infernal mercilessness, furiousness, and vengefulness, even to the point of death. But this fact is not recognized, not understood, and therefore simply accepted unthinkingly by the believers, because they are so caught up in the religious sectarian delusion suggested to them that they cannot grasp any thoughts of their own, but only those hypnotically forced upon them in relation to their belief in sectarianism. Therefore, they are also unable to muster any will of their own to grasp a rational and rational perception of truth, and to make logical decisions in order to free themselves from their delusional belief in God. From this fact, it can be absolutely clearly defined that the delusion of God suggestively imposed on human beings clouds their understanding and reason, and makes them incapable of recognizing the effective truth which is given in the fact that it is not an imaginary God, but they themselves alone who must decide everything and anything, and accordingly act and work according to their understanding and reason. But since the human beings who believe in God become stupid with regard to their faith, they become dependent fools of faith, which is why it can be said that every religious faith is an insane fanatical delusion of blind-hearted fools of faith. And when I list all these effective facts, put them at the stake and thus denounce them, be it with regard to all the fallible ones I have mentioned in connection with the USA, or with regard to the religion delusional God believers, I am not thereby trying to raise myself above them, for I never want to be above them, and also not above any other human beings, which is why I also never try to be anyone other than who I am. And it is exactly from this point of view that I want to say something about violence, non-violence, peace and freedom, because in the world everything that is evil, hatred, terror and wars is constantly growing more and more, whereby in the USA Trump, who is an absolutely incompetent president, is causing the whole world to be in turmoil, just as the USA, which is the only and first place as a world hegemony maniac and destroyer of peace, freedom and the world, also has U.S. President Harry S. Truman did, who committed the greatest crime ever committed against humanity by ordering the use of atomic bombs. But also the terrorist Osama bin Laden, who was trained in the USA, brought the world into turmoil as a criminal, as did also the U.S. Presidents George Herbert Walker Bush and his son George Walker Bush, along with various other U.S. presidents, secret services and military powers, etc., as all evil, uprisings, discord and lack of freedom, hatred and terror, as well as injustice, enmity, killings and murders, wars, criminality and crimes of all kinds, as well as family breakups, natural disasters, lack of interpersonal relationships and the destruction of the planet, its fauna and flora, and the overpopulation in the world that is guilty of it, continue to grow inexorably. So too does the extinction and destruction of many living beings, as well as the ever more degenerating manifold forms of violence. The events of the present time often resemble the sequences of earlier occurrences, developments, processes in the course of events which since time immemorial have shaken the world in a malignant way and have brought harm, disaster, catastrophes, heavy blows of fate, tragedies and immortality to the human beings of the earth. Since time immemorial, the earth has been plunged through the fault of mankind with evil mishaps and with tremendous complications, disasters and misfortunes into distress and misery and often almost into final ruin, whereby also today, tomorrow, and still in the far future the same or similar and malignant events and occurrences threaten to hang like a sword of Damocles over the earth and its entire humanity. The fact is, however, that some earthling, some human being of the earth, who succeeded in gaining power over nations, was always and in every case to blame for all the dramas, human defeats, fiascos, wars, visitations, catastrophes, and misfortunes, etc. that were brought about, although the authors of these had already determined their downfall before they reached the height of their power. Examples of this are emperors, kings, presidents, dictators, and all kinds of other rulers who drove their peoples and those of other countries into misery, hardship, death, and ruin, such as Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. To name but these two from modern times, but where such sad figures have worked viciously, murdering and destroying the world over all past centuries and millennia. As then in all ancient times, today the state powers, the politicians, the president and the rulers of the USA are equal to the old despotic, autocratic, murderous and criminal rulers of earlier centuries and millennia, whereby since the founding of the U.S. states, these have been turned to this day into a gigantic center of power surrounded by the bottomless impotence of marginalized and humiliated peoples, the majority of whom tremble in fear of U.S. power just as the U.S. rulers, their vassals and supporters, tremble in cowardly fear of Russia. Global terrorism, which is fundamentally the fault of the U.S. as a result of its world domination-addicted intrigues. Arms races, nasty, underhanded, criminal interferences as well as acts of war all over the world reveals all around the symptom of a world completely out of joint. This, however, also fuels the growing hatred against U.S. America, as it appears in many countries in their populations, whereby, in the social world, as a result of differences of opinion between the pro-USA affirmative and the contra, the USA rejective, concomitants such as discontent and discord appear, consequently, in all earthly countries. The opinion of the pro and contra with regard to the USA is a reason for disputes and quarrels. Hatred is in any case always a motive for quarrels, violence, and finally, when everything degenerates for an uncontrollable, murderous, destructive rage, which as a rule leads to the fact that the perpetrator and the victim can be distinguished less and less. And that is because human beings have not learned to control their emotions and other impulses. Starting with the child, through the simple worker, to the civil servant, doctor, and office holder, as well as politician, head of might and state, as well as preacher, clergy, and religious bigwigs. So the same problem also arises with the human beings in the political and governmental centers of power, where, as everywhere, exclusion and humiliation are the order of the day, although everything in this way proceeds somewhat differently in the so-called great power state than in the underprivileged countries. This is why it is also the case that in the USA the presidential oaf Trump, with his stupidity, his childish lack of understanding, his lack of intelligence and abysmal lack of reason, is leading a confrontation of terror and war of evil, making protagonistic presidential use of these two unvalues and behaving like Adolf Hitler once did, as U.S. leader and equally like George W. Bush used to. In this way, the U.S. riveting president, Trample Trump, behaves like a mirror image and dark doppelganger of other pompous state powers who have ultimately catapulted themselves out of office, or been assassinated, through their own primitiveness. Stupidity, simple-mindedness, and inexorable stupidity. Now, American foreign policy is devastating everything in the world and creating new strife and lack of freedom in the world again and again through its gunboat diplomacy and nuclear arsenal. The U.S. pursues a policy of unrestrained hegemonic domination with a vicious disregard for all non-American human lives through barbaric intelligence operations and military interventions. In doing so, they also provide support to despotic and dictatorial regimes and unscrupulously promote their economic aspirations, as well as mercilessly eat through the economies of poor countries like a swarm of locusts, some sneaky and some viciously brutal, robbing them and making them U.S. dependent in a sleazy way. In this way, the USA exerts a cunningly marauding might, and that too here in Europe, as it influences the minds of human beings and brings them over to its side through lies and deceit. When the presidential oaf Trump, as the leader of salvation, overrides the laws of the international community with his insane decrees, etc., thinking that he can thereby consolidate his own power and cover up his involvement in dishonest machinations, and indeed succeeds in doing so, then it is not surprising when victims and perpetrators can no longer be distinguished in the world. As president, he feels like a god and provokes despair through his ignorant non-commitment, which he personally interprets as strength, and thus also initiates violence. And it is precisely this violence that is accumulating, with degenerating excesses becoming more and more frequent. Which is why many human beings are becoming increasingly alarmed and do not know what else is going to happen. Terrible events are becoming more and more frequent, with horrifying examples of escalating atrocities being shown on television every day, the sources of which are often rooted in the cynical and cruel actions of national leaders. The despair caused throughout the world by the machinations of the rulers, politicians, secret services, and the military only reinforces all the terror instead of combating it. As a result, everything is obviously being done to exterminate earthly humanity and to destroy the whole planet, whereby the ever-increasing and uncontrolled overpopulation and the destructive machinations arising from it are the best means and preconditions. This may indeed be one reason why the whole bulk of all politicians, rulers, people in power, and the entire world of the clergy, from the simple lay preacher to the clergy and the highest religious bigwigs, vehemently refuse to point out to the citizens and the believers of all countries who are obsessed with the delusion of God that the destruction and annihilation of nature, its fauna and flora of the planet, of all life and all existence, are brought about by overpopulation and its catastrophically degenerated machinations. The majority of state leaders, state powers and their vassals, etc., are false gods who promise their peoples power and strength again and again, but which they cannot give them, which is why they infamously degrade all weaker ones to enemies. Because as state figures they are themselves the true enemies of their peoples, whereby it frightens them that the peoples might recognize the truth and throw them down from their high state pedestals. But the bulk of the state powers of all kinds do not fall from their pedestals, for they continue to suggest their alleged divinity to their peoples, and thus lead the whole world as ever into error, into misery and distress, into terror, war and ruin. And these false gods suggest to their peoples a death drive through which they almost rejoice, willingly, hallucinatingly and inflamedly seek death in revolts and wars when their false gods order them to do so, and they joyfully go into battle to murder, kill, rape, and destroy in order to sacrifice their own lives, unthinking and unconditionally believing in the false gods. In a suggestive manner, the state false gods force their peoples into deadly situations as outright victims, whereby it becomes virtually impossible to distinguish how and whether the victims ultimately remain victims or become degenerate perpetrators. Basically, a development arises in this way through which a clear and correct perception is distorted in such a way that it tends towards destructiveness, and thus conditions for peace. Freedom, friendships, justice, and for a healthy humanity can never be created. These are facts that are on my stomach and always bother me, which is why I never have any choice but to remain silent, but to speak, and not keep my thoughts to myself.
Those were good words.
Thanks. Somehow I feel a little better now that I have once again been able to say what keeps bothering me.
Which I can well understand. But now we should turn to those things and important things. Which is why we have come together today, because the time is advanced. And what still needs to be done will also not be discussed quickly, nor can it be done quickly.
Okay, then I guess you, Quetzal, can go outside with me first, so that we can discuss the necessary work to be done in the bungers, while you, Ptah, dear friend, in the meantime can do these